About 8 years ago, when I was still in college, I decided to get a job in order to cover my expenses. However, due to the fact that I had most of my day committed to my studies, I was forced to get a night job. I received several offers, but most of them had to do with bars, discos, and things like that. And while I needed the job, the truth is that I'm not a fan of that kind of environment. But fortunately, shortly after I got a call from a food factory that was not too far from my house, this seemed perfect for me, because although the work was somewhat demanding, at least I would not have to deal with drunks wanting to overdo it, plus the pay was good, so it didn't take me long to accept the job. At first it was a little difficult for me to adapt to this schedule, since I was used to sleeping early, and in addition to this, I saw classes during the day, which left me very few hours to rest. But I really needed the job, so I had to make an effort to adapt as quickly as possible to my new rhythm of life. Although I chose to work the night shift, most of the workers had rotating shifts, so I was not working with a fixed group of people, but rather my shift partners were constantly changing. This was perfect for me, because to be honest, I am not the most sociable person in the world. Quite the contrary. However, I tried to get along with everyone, and after a few weeks I had already made friends with several of them. I had successfully completed my first fortnight of work, and to pick up my first check, I had to go to the office that Monday, before going to the university, since the administrative offices work exclusively during the day. I remember that when I arrived at the office that day, everyone started to ask me about how I had done in that shift. I told them the truth, that at first it had cost me a little to adapt to the sleeplessness, but actually I liked it more than I expected, because at night the atmosphere is much quieter. There is not so much noise nor much work to do, which even allowed me to have my headphones on most of the time. At that moment, several of my companions looked at each other, something that caught my attention, but I did not give it much importance. It was then when one of my companions asked me if I had not seen anything strange. I thought she was referring to someone doing something wrong. That is, drinking or consuming some kind of substance or things like that, but I had not seen anything like that, so I said no. That's when one of the admin girls asked him to shut up and not to try to scare me. Then out of nowhere he changed the subject and started talking about politics, and that's not a subject I'm very passionate about, so I just went with the flow and downplayed our previous conversation. A couple of days later I arrived at the factory a little late, as that afternoon I had to prepare a very long presentation that I had to present the next morning at the university, and being that I had classes almost immediately after leaving work, I knew I would not have time to finish it in the morning, which made me about half an hour late getting into the shift, and due to how fast I left the house, I forgot to bring my headphones. This was really a bummer, as listening to music was the best way to keep me awake while doing my work, and also to entertain me when there was nothing to do. That night I finished my chores fairly early, and not having much else to entertain me, I decided to go out for a walk and say hello to the guys in the warehouse. But to get there, I had to walk almost all the way through the building. As I was walking down the hallway of the administrative offices, which was completely alone at that hour, I bent down to tie my braids, and then I clearly heard someone running behind me. I immediately stood up and turned to see who it was, but there was no one there. This left me very puzzled. I was sure of what I had heard, and also the footsteps sounded very close. I looked towards the hallway and asked who was there, but no one answered me. I asked once more, but there was no answer either. It was then when I started to hear a laugh. It was like a child's laugh, and it could be heard very clearly. At first I was a little scared, but then I thought it was probably one of my classmates trying to play a joke on me, so I said, yeah guys, nice try, but better luck next time," and continued on my way, hoping to hear someone come out and start joking about it. But that didn't happen. Instead, I heard this childish laughter again, and again the sound of someone running after me. I immediately turned around to see who it was, but once again there was no one. At that moment I did begin to feel afraid, for I heard the footsteps and the laughter just behind me, a meter or two away, and I turned quickly, so that if it had been one of my companions I would not have had a chance to hide. Then I began to hear the laughter again, but no longer behind me. This time it was heard all over the place, as if whatever was producing that sound was flying all over the hallway. At that very moment I began to feel all the hairs on my back stand up, while a knot began to form in my stomach. This did not make any sense, and my mind could not find any earthly explanation for what I was experiencing. I was so scared, but instead of running, which is what most would do, I was completely paralyzed, as if my feet were glued to the floor with cement. The laughter continued for about a minute or two, and then it just disappeared, and everything went quiet again. By then my heart was already beating 1,000 beats a second, and my breathing was out of control. The first thing I did when I came out of my paralyzed state was to run down the hallway, and I didn't stop until I got to the warehouse, where I told the guys, still in a panic and almost in tears, what I had experienced just a moment ago. As I was telling the guys what had just happened to me, they looked at each other as if it was nothing unusual what I was telling them. Then someone brought me a cup of the coffee they had recently prepared and began to explain that I was not the only one who had experienced these phenomena, and that in fact it had taken me a long time to experience them. One of my colleagues told me that these phenomena occurred almost daily, that they were used to it, but they never told me anything so as not to scare me. There were even workers in the past who claimed to have seen the child. This really made my hair stand on end. I had no idea that these things happened in that factory. Suddenly it came to my head like a flash, the question that the day shift colleague asked me when I went to get my pay. But the story does not end there. A few weeks later, when I went again to pick up my check at the administration office, I met again with the group of colleagues of the day, among them the one who asked me if I had experienced something strange. I told them about it and told them what had happened to me that night, and they told me the same as my night shift colleagues, that all those who have come to cover that schedule have come across at least once with the ghost of the child, but also told me who this child was. According to one of my colleagues, they presume that this is the older brother of the current owner of the company. According to what I was told, this happened 40 years ago. One day, the father of our boss, who was the founder of the company, wanted to take his 6-year-old son to visit the facilities, as he insisted that he wanted to see them. It seems that that morning there was a problem in one of the plants, which required him to go immediately to the site. At that moment, he left his son alone in his office. However, he began to play in the corridors like any other child, but while exploring the place, he arrived at one of the machine rooms, where the noise is deafening due to the operation of the equipment that is in charge of processing raw materials. But upon arriving at the place, the child got too close to one of the machines. The child got too close to one of the huge shredding machines, with the bad luck that his shirt got tangled in the machine, which caused it to pull the child without anyone noticing, since no one knew that the little boy was there, and with all the noise of the machinery it was impossible to hear him. When the father arrived after having solved the problem in the plant, he realized that his son was not there and began to look for him everywhere. But while he was walking through all the aisles trying to find him, one of his employees approached him and gave him the terrible news. It is said that the man was completely devastated, and no wonder, and when he saw what had happened to his little boy, his screams could be heard throughout the plant. When I heard this story, I was tremendously moved. I felt a lump in my throat and my eyes filled with tears just imagining the pain that it must have meant for that man and his family to go through a tragedy of that magnitude. The fact is that since then, this type of paranormal phenomena began to occur in the factory. While we were talking about it, our department head approached us, and I immediately noticed that everyone was silent. When I noticed this gesture, I also shut my mouth, but it seems that he had heard everything. And then he called our attention for spreading that kind of rumors, and he reprimanded me for using my headphones during my shift, since I had told my colleagues that maybe the reason I had not heard the laughter, the footsteps, and all these phenomena before was because I always had them on. But from that day on, I was not allowed to use them anymore. This was a real torture, because from then on I started to experience a lot of other phenomena, because it was not only the laughter, you could also hear footsteps, doors opening, doors closing. You even used to hear the toilet lever being lowered when there was absolutely no one in the bathroom. At first it was so scary that I thought about quitting, but then the same thing happened to me as to the rest of my colleagues. I just got used to it. Besides, I needed the job and I knew it would be very difficult to find another one as close to my home, as comfortable and as well paid as that one, so I kept working there. And once I graduated, I was promoted. But I immediately asked for a shift change. Now I work during the day, and curiously, I have never again encountered the boy's ghost. I have been a night owl for as long as I can remember. That's why since I started my working life, I have almost always worked night shifts. And also because I don't get along with people, that includes my co-workers, clients, or even my own family members. I could say I am one of those guys that hates people. Fortunately, some years ago, I got a job that perfectly fit my lifestyle and my personality. A job where I didn't have to deal with anyone, since I was alone most of the time. I started working as a night janitor at a high school. In this country, many schools have had night cleaning for many years, but especially in the last 3 years, due to the new health and hygiene codes. This is mandatory in all schools, something that benefited me a lot. Because although I had more than 10 years working in this profession, previously I worked in an elementary school where I was not paid very well. But 3 years ago, the COVID-19 situation gave me the opportunity to change jobs and work in a private school where I had very good working conditions and the pay was much better. However, it was in this place where I lived such a terrifying experience that made me seriously reconsider continuing to work the night shift. This high school was quite large and had a very large enrollment, ranging from kindergarten through 12th grade. Because of the large facilities and the prominent number of students, the school had a good group of cleaners during the day, but at night it was just my partner and I, who divided the school in two, and we usually cleaned each other's half and rarely interacted with each other. At first, she always approached me and tried to seek conversations, but as I told you, I'm not a sociable guy, and I hate to chat about nonsense with others. So noticing my lack of receptivity, she simply gave up. And since then, each one does his own thing and does not bother the other. The truth is, I would rather spend a full 10 hours cleaning the entire school by myself than have to interact with another human being, even if it is less work. However, the first day of the dead I got to work at this new school, I really appreciated not being alone. That day I arrived at the institution punctually at the usual time, at 8 p.m., since my work schedule is from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. I went in, as I do every day, straight to work, without even stopping to greet my coworker. I went straight to work, as I do every day, without even stopping to greet my coworker. We started working at opposite ends of the building and met in the middle, so that we would only see each other when we had finished our work and were on our way out. At the beginning, everything was normal, just like every day. Whenever I go to work, I always put on my headphones, albeit at a moderate volume, as I don't like to listen to loud music, but this serves a dual purpose. By the time I go in, most of the teachers have already left, but there are always some who like to stay late doing academic stuff or revising exams or whatever. But these sometimes get chatty with the janitors and start talking nonsense. But in my case, when they see me with my headphones on, they assume I am not listening to them, although I do, but I prefer to ignore them. However, that was not the case that night, as all the teachers had left and there was no one else in the institution, just my partner and I, who at that time, at 9 o'clock at night, were still far away from each other. But for some reason I seemed to hear voices, or rather murmurs. I took off my headphones for a moment so that I could hear more clearly, and then I realized that they were coming from the hallway behind me. I walked through it, checking between classrooms, but saw nothing. Although that puzzled me a bit, the truth is that I didn't want to think too much about it and just ignored it. So I put my headphones back on and continued listening to music as if nothing had happened. After mopping a good stretch of the floor, I went to one of the bathrooms to change the water, and while I was there, I heard a loud noise, like something falling to the floor, and it came from the hallway I had just mopped. I quickly left the bathroom with the bucket full of water in my hand, and as I approached it, I noticed that one of the wet floor signs I had placed had fallen. But more than that, it was a few feet further away from where I had placed it, as if someone had kicked it, making it fall further away. This was somewhat intriguing, but as with the mumbling, I tried not to make a big deal of it. So I picked it back up and convinced myself that maybe I hadn't placed it where I thought I had. I just didn't want to think about it too much, but I'm lying if I tell you I wasn't starting to get antsy. In order to lift the sign, I had to walk on the wet floor. So then I had to step over my footprints again. But then, something else caught my attention. And that is that next to my footprints there was another set of footprints, smaller, like a child's. These covered the whole hallway and were lost in the stairs leading to the second floor. I went up to the second floor and checked among the classrooms there as well, but found no one. This was very disconcerting, and from that moment on, the tension began to take over my body. I wiped up all the footprints, including the child's, and continued mopping through what was left of the hallway, trying to downplay the importance of what had happened. But the truth is that it was not so easy not to think that there was no child who could have walked on the wet floor and left his footprints there, since there was no one in that place except me. I looked back to see if I could see my companion, but she was still far away. I unplugged the headphones and put the music loud on my phone, this in order that if someone was there they could hear it too. And as I did so, I saw out of the corner of my eye that someone passed behind me and seemed to go down the stairs to the second floor. I could even hear their footsteps, so I ran up there thinking, gotcha, because they were actually very close. But when I got to the second floor, there was no one. But the most disturbing thing is I kept hearing the steps, as if someone was running down the hallway. Suddenly, other footsteps were heard, and others, and then others. And suddenly, it was as if there was a great stampede in the whole hallway. But there was no one, just me, who was all alone standing at the foot of the stairs contemplating the huge empty hallway. At that moment, I began to hear children's laughter, and something more creepy. In the background of it all, I could hear like a little girl singing a play song. At that moment, I felt like I was in a horror movie. I felt my body paralyzed and my head was spinning, trying to find an explanation for what I was experiencing that night. It was something absolutely creepy that I had never, in over 20 years working the night shift, had ever experienced. The noises continued for several minutes when, out of nowhere, in an instant, everything simply went out. But this happened too abruptly. Just as quickly as the noise started, it ended. At that moment, my nerves were at their peak. I could feel every hair on my body standing on end, while my hands began to tremble. I consider myself a tough guy, someone who doesn't scare easily, but this situation truly terrified me, because it was something that didn't make any sense. I would have preferred 1,000 times to deal with a thief than whatever it was that was causing chaos that night. With my senses fully alert, I walked to the end of the hallway, still trying to find something that could justify all this madness. But there was nothing. The whole place was completely empty. I stood there for a moment looking around, until I heard a loud bang that seemed to come from the first floor. So I ran out and down the stairs, only to find that the bucket of water I had filled a while ago had been knocked over, and the whole hallway was full of water. To be honest, at that moment I felt more angry than scared, as the rage of knowing that I had to mop it all up again, for a moment, overcame the fear I felt before. I went back to the nearest closet to get a dry mop and a bunch of towels. It took me about half an hour to clean up the whole mess, and then about 15 more minutes redoing the rest of the floor, which had been completely ruined. By then, it was almost midnight. I was tremendously angry about the whole situation, and it was at that moment that I remembered my roommate, so I went all the way across the school just to ask her if she had heard any noise that night, or if she was the one messing with me. Upon hearing my question, which was obviously more haughty than usual, the woman looked very confused and seemed genuinely innocent. She replied that she didn't know what I was talking about and asked if I needed help with anything, but I replied with a resounding no and immediately returned to my area. I worked for another hour without anything strange happening, and fortunately I managed to make some progress, but I still felt very angry that I had wasted so much time with all this paranormal garbage. For an instant, the thought of calling the police crossed my mind, but I dismissed it immediately, because I couldn't tell them what had happened without them thinking I was completely crazy or using something, so I kept working to finish as soon as possible and go home. But when I was close to finishing my work, at about 2 a.m., the lights went out completely, and the whole school was plunged into complete darkness for about 10 seconds, until the emergency lights came on and everything turned reddish. At that moment, the fear came back, because it looked really scary. For an instant, I stopped everything I was doing and stood in the middle of the hallway waiting for anything that could happen. Suddenly, I began to feel a sensation of being watched. I looked everywhere. I don't even know why, because at this point, I was more than sure that there was no one in the school, apart from my classmate and me. I tried to convince myself that it was a simple fault in the electrical system, and I had to use all the courage I had in me to walk to the electrical room and check the circuit breaker box. When I got to the door of the room, I realized that it was already open. This made me feel a great shiver. I pushed the door slowly, fearful of what I might find, and I advanced slowly in the darkness towards the interior, looking for the switch to turn on the emergency lights inside the room. And that's what I was doing, when suddenly I looked in front of me and saw that a figure appeared in front of me in the middle of the darkness. In the middle of the shadows I could distinguish a human figure, or more or less, but it was huge, about 2.5 meters approximately. Its legs were too long, but in an unnatural way, too long in relation to the rest of its body, while its head seemed too small. I could not make out any other features in this figure because of the darkness, only its enormous size and strange shape, and the fact that a very dense energy could be felt around it, a sensation that made my blood run cold. At that moment I quickly turned around and tried to get out of the place, but suddenly the door slammed in my face, and I heard clearly when the safety latch rattled, leaving me completely trapped with whatever that thing was. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. I stood completely frozen, terrified, and without moving a muscle, waiting for whatever that thing from hell was going to do to me. However, at that instant I heard someone turn the key in the lock, and a second later the door opened. A light hit me right in the face, at the same time that a loud scream shook the room. It was my partner, who like me had the idea of coming to check in the electrical room, but she was too surprised to find me in there since the door was locked. At that very moment, I instinctively looked behind me to see the figure under the light of my friend's lamp, but it was gone. There was nothing, and as if by magic, a second later the lights came on. At that moment my partner started to ask me questions about why I was there, and if it was me who had interrupted the electricity, but I was too stressed, terrified, and bewildered to be answering silly questions, so I just told her that I would go home, and that if it was her I would not stay alone in that place. And so I did, put all the cleaning utensils in storage, then gathered my things, and got the hell out of there. The next day I received a call from the administrator, who seemed to be very upset about my fault, and for leaving my shift partner alone. But she couldn't care less. That same day, I quit, and I only stepped foot in that damn school again the day I went to get my paycheck, and I never set foot in that place again. After that terrifying experience, I decided to take a month's sabbatical before looking for a new job, and after that, I got a job as a security guard at a dealership, where I work to this day, and I honestly don't plan to work in a school again for the rest of my life. The story I am going to tell you today happened in 2018 when I was 22 years old. At that time, I was working as a waitress on the night shift at a busy restaurant in town. This was one of the few gourmet restaurants that worked 24 hours, and the reason I chose the night shift is because they paid more, and usually the biggest flow of work was between 8 and 10 p.m. But from then on, the truth is that it was a pretty relaxed pace. Another advantage of working there was that it was only a 15-minute walk from my house, and less than 5 minutes if I took the subway, which was what I used to do every day after my shift, which was from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m., although it was still dark at that time. That particular day, the workday was a bit busier than usual. It was a Saturday, and very close to the restaurant there was an open-air concert, so the place was full of people, and many of them went to the restaurant after enjoying the presentations. So when leaving, I decided to do something different, since it was a very nice summer night, and this seemed perfect to clear my mind. That's why instead of taking the subway, I decided to walk home and enjoy some of the night scenery. This may sound like something dangerous to most people, but to put it in context, I live in a country where the crime rate is extremely low, and my city is no exception. It's quite safe and almost never any crime and things like that happen. The most crimes that occur in my country are more related to scams, traffic tickets, dealers of prohibited substances, and the occasional street fight, but not much more. That is why I did not see any risk in walking home. Besides, on the way there was a small park and also a bridge that is very famous in my city, as it offers beautiful views of the city itself. A small park with many trees and the river that passes under the bridge. Strange as it may seem to you, these are especially beautiful at night. I used to visit those places often when I was in high school. But once I entered college and started working at night, I never had time to go again, and that night for some reason I felt like walking around that place, since I always missed it when traveling by subway. I gave my turn to the morning girl, and when I left the store, as expected, it was still dark. I started walking, and while enjoying the summer breeze and the spectacular view of the river that the picturesque bridge offered me, I noticed a tall man walking in the opposite direction, wearing a long coat. At first I didn't think anything of it until I saw that he was picking up his pace and coming straight in my direction. At that moment, I stood still for a moment and leaned against the railing, for I had nowhere to go. It was then when, without saying a single word, the man came up to me and slapped me. I was in complete shock, taken completely by surprise, but I didn't have time to recover, as that slap was followed by another, and then another. After that flurry of slaps, all I did was put my hands over my face, feeling completely helpless and terrified, as this man, at least 6 feet tall, was looking down on me with a look of deep anger. At that instant I tried to run, but he grabbed my arm and threw me back against the railing, reached into his coat and said, "You better stay still, because I have a knife here, and I can use it on you if you provoke me." My eyes widened, and feeling in complete panic, I started crying and pleading with him not to hurt me, but he slapped me again and told me to shut up. At that point, I had no idea what the hell that man wanted with me. I looked in all directions to see if I saw anyone who could help me, but there was no one. At that hour, almost no one was passing through that area. For an instant, I thought he intended to abuse me. After all, on the other side of the bridge, very close to where we were, was the park, and this place was completely dark and full of trees. So my biggest fear was that he would pull out his knife and take me kidnapped to that place, but that's not what he did. Instead, he watched me in that unhinged way for a few minutes while I was completely paralyzed and waiting for whatever he wanted to do to me. But then, out of nowhere, he started crying, knelt down and hugged my waist. I swear at that moment I was shaking with pure panic. This man was either very, very sick in the head, or he was under the effects of something, which made him completely unpredictable. The man stood there for a few minutes with his hands around my body and crying with his head on my abdomen, soaking my shirt with his tears. For a moment I thought about running, but then it seemed best to stay still. This guy was armed and completely out of it, and with his arms wrapped tightly around me, there was no way I could escape. So I just waited while my heart thundered in my ears and I felt my whole body shaking with fear. But then, out of nowhere, he stood up, started wiping his tears hard with the back of his hands and scrunching his nose hard, and without looking me in the face, he simply said, "I'm sorry," and went on his way. As soon as he left, I started running and crying desperately. All I wanted was to get home, take a hot bath, and curl up in my bed, but then I started hearing footsteps behind me in the distance. I looked back and saw that madman running in my direction. That's when I picked up my pace and started screaming for help. I needed to alert someone of what was happening, someone who could help me. However, a few minutes later, I stopped hearing the footsteps. I turned to see if he was still following me, but he was gone. Still, I kept running and didn't stop until I reached my house. The first thing I did when I got there was to lock the door behind me, lean my back against it, still afraid that this madman had followed me there, and call my boyfriend to tell him what had happened to me. Within 5 minutes, he was at my house with a police officer. I told them both what had happened to me and gave the police officer a detailed description of the guy who attacked me, after which he left and told me to stay in my house. A few hours later, I received a call notifying me that my attacker had been found and was under arrest. That morning, 2 more women reported being assaulted by a man with the same characteristics, very close to where he attacked me. But the scariest thing is that one of them received a stab wound. Fortunately, the man was put in prison and received a 14-year sentence for aggravated assault with a knife and attempted murder. That day it was determined that the subject was under the influence of a prohibited substance, as I thought. This is the most terrifying episode I have faced to this day, and it took me a long time to get over it. In fact, I could never again walk over the bridge without remembering that incident, and it never occurred to me to walk home at that hour. Fortunately, I was able to get out of that situation without anything more than my face hurting from the slaps, but I can't help but think about the girl he stabbed, and the fact that he could have easily done the same to me. Luckily, the girl managed to survive, but she came close to not making it. I am definitely grateful for my good fortune, and for being able to be here to tell this story. Eight years ago, I took a night job as a security guard in an old condominium located in a popular area of the city. At the time, the association had serious concerns about the security of the site, due to the way the buildings had been constructed in the 1960s. One of these concerns was that the 2 levels of parking were accessible from the street, so there were multiple access points. And to make matters worse, several of them were located in blind spots in the security camera system. Because of this, my job required making 2 rounds around the entire building to make sure that no one could enter the building from these points. This was a pretty tough job, and even a bit dangerous to be done by only one person. Ideally, there should be 2 or 3 watchmen during the night. However, the condominium had a well-established budget for that position, and if it was necessary to hire someone else, they had to split the pay between 2 so the salary would be less, and the truth is that what they were offering me to do the job by myself was pretty good. And being honest, at this moment I really needed the money, so I did not think too much and accepted the job. The most serious problem in the place was car theft, but this did not happen too often. Instead, most of the time my main problem was the homeless people, who frequently entered the parking lot in order to look for some shelter, and quite regularly I would find one of them huddled in a corner. The truth is that it made me feel pretty bad to have to send them back to the street. If it were up to me, I would let them sleep there, as it must be horrible to have nowhere to shelter in the cold nights. But the condo inhabitants did not think the same as me, so inevitably I had to evict them as soon as I found them inside the premises. And after working there for several months, I knew perfectly well which were the places where I could find them hiding. These buildings were very old and had undergone many renovations over the years, which caused there to be many corners, cracks, and places that should not exist in the building, such as sealed rooms, stairs out of place, and corridors that led nowhere. But without a doubt, the creepiest place in the whole building, both scary and dangerous, was on the 2nd floor of the parking lot, where there was a door that opened and led to a corridor that was exactly below the ramp leading to the 2nd level. This was about 3 feet wide and stretched for about 8 or 9 meters, but literally this corridor led to nowhere. At the end of it, what there was a huge water pipe with a valve, which was the only reason that space existed, but in the dark, and only with the poor light of a flashlight, that pipe could take the shape of anything, which made it somewhat frightening. However, that was not even the most dangerous thing about that place, but the lock on the metal door of the corridor had no padlock or eye on either side, but it did have on the outside a sliding bolt latch that could be locked from the outside, but there was no way to open that door from the inside. That is, there was only one way to get in and out of that place, and that was to leave the door open while doing whatever you were doing in there. But if by bad luck, someone closed the door while inside, they would have no way to get out. Ever since I discovered that place, I couldn't help but think how easy it could be to get trapped there. So I set out to take pictures of that place and other dangerous places in the building, as well as all the potentially dangerous places in the building. Then I presented these pictures to the condo managers, explaining how risky they were, both to me and to anyone who had no knowledge of this. However, any impressions I had about it were completely ignored, until one day, my worst fears were realized. When I was about 8 months or so into working at the site, one night I was in the middle of my shift. It was about 3 a.m. at the time, and I was doing my 2nd round of the night. This had been a quiet day like any other on a Tuesday, no homeless people sneaking around, no suspicious activity on the cameras, nothing to worry about, at least up to that point. But when it was about 3:30 a.m., I heard something that made me immediately alert, and it was the sound of a door slamming shut. At the time, I wasn't sure exactly where the noise had come from, so I set out to investigate. I took a round around the whole place, and everything seemed to be in order until I reached the dead-end hallway, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw that the large metal door was wide open. It was obvious that the door had not opened by itself, which meant that someone had been or was there. I looked around to see if there was anyone in the area, but I didn't see anyone. Then I shouted to alert anyone who might be lurking around, but I didn't hear anything, and no one appeared. At this point, what really worried me was that there might be someone hiding in the dead-end hallway, so I stepped inside with my eyes wide open and my flashlight pointed in all directions. I was actually relieved when I focused all the way in and saw that no one was there. However, I could tell that there was an empty bottle of rum near the pipe. The first thing that came to my mind is that someone or several people were drinking there, and upon noticing my presence while making the rounds, they ran off in a hurry, leaving the bottle behind and accidentally making noise. This would not surprise me at all, since it was not the first time something like this happened, as this dead-end hallway was one of those places from which you could access from the street, and it was also in one of the blind spots of the security cameras, so on more than one occasion, I must have pulled some bum out of there, since after all, these people knew the building even better than I did. At that point, I debated about going on and looking for the bottle or leaving it there, first because it was so far in the background, and second because I was really scared of that place. But one of the things I was required to do was not to leave trash in the area, so I knew I had to go pick it up, because if anyone else came across it tomorrow, they would think that I didn't keep an eye on this place, or that I was drinking there myself. I took a deep breath before entering, making sure, of course, to leave the door wide open, but just the same, I could feel the nerves taking hold of me from the moment I first set foot inside. For an instant, I was about to back out and go back to the camera room, but I tried to calm myself down and convince myself that there was no one in the parking lot, so there was no way I was going to be locked in there, so I inhaled hard and started to walk into the hallway. I walked over to the bottle, but as I bent down to pick it up, I heard the door slam shut. I immediately ran over there and started banging on the door and yelling for help, but there was no one around the parking lot at that hour. I immediately started to get claustrophobic, as being locked in that place felt like being buried alive. It was an absolutely suffocating and terrifying feeling. I kept screaming and banging on the door for several minutes, and my only consolation was that I had my flashlight with me, because if I had been locked up and completely in the dark in that place, I don't know what would have become of me. After a few minutes, I remembered that I had my cell phone in my pocket, so I pulled it out to call 911, or someone who could come help me, but there was no signal. The phone was totally out of service, which is not surprising considering that these walls were made of concrete blocks, and the door was made of very thick metal, besides having the entire 6 floors of the building above, as the parking lot was on a subway level. Everything was against me that night. There was absolutely nothing I could do. The only chance I had to escape was at 7 in the morning at shift change, when my partner of the day came to relieve me. But it was only 3:30, so whoever caught me in that place had a margin of almost 4 hours to do whatever he wanted in the parking lot. A few minutes later, I heard several car alarms go off, then I knew exactly what was happening. But then they quickly went off. I kept shouting and banging on the door with all my might, but after a while I simply gave up hope of being released and concentrated on trying to stay calm and not panic, because it was really claustrophobic to be in that locked-up place. On the other hand, there was also the possibility of running out of oxygen. From then on, all I did was sit on the floor with my back against the wall and turn off my flashlight to clear the batteries, but every few minutes I kept knocking on the door and asking for help, in case someone came out or arrived at that time. But it wasn't until 7:20 in the morning, when my relief arrived, late by the way, that finally freed me from that cement trap. By then I had fallen asleep, so it took me a few minutes to realize where I was and remember what had happened in the early morning. When my partner saw me, he asked me what I was doing there and what had happened, so I told him everything. The next thing I had to do was to call the police, because after doing a little inspection with my partner, we realized that at least a dozen cars had been broken into. There was broken glass all over the place. The criminals had smashed the windows of the cars and forced the locks, stolen tires, batteries, and the personal belongings of the car owners. It was clear that whoever locked me in the dead-end hallway that night knew exactly what they were doing. They had watched me long enough to set up a decoy knowing I would go down, and they also knew how to silence the alarms. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages were lost that night, and I was fired from my job that very morning. Unfortunately, they never found the culprit, although my partner suspected the watchman who had worked that shift before me, but that could never be proven. My name is Edgar, and I am 50 years old. Throughout my life, I have done a lot of things. I have worked in practically all kinds of areas, since I have been earning my own living since I was 17 years old, so I have a lot of anecdotes that I can tell you, most of them funny and somewhat bizarre. But the one I am going to share with you today is not funny at all. It is rather one of the most terrifying things that happened to me when I was working for this company. This story began in the middle of the year 2000. At the time, I was living in the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and had just started working as a credit manager for a rental company. By then, I was in my 20s, an age that was quite complicated for me, as after dropping out of college a few years earlier and working tirelessly for several years without a break, I had decided to invest my savings, as I was completely convinced that I would become rich someday, but unfortunately, instead I lost all my money in bad deals. And now I was living in a small apartment that I really couldn't afford. The bills were starting to pile up on top of each other, so I needed to find a job with a decent salary as soon as possible. That's when an old friend contacted me, told me he was leaving his job as a credit manager and that the company was looking for a replacement. When he first told me about the job, I naively thought that the company rented furniture and appliances to other companies just for events, and once they were done renting the items, they would return them, so I thought, how hard could it be? But once I was hired, I realized that I wasn't even close to knowing what the business was really about. I found out that the company's business model was to rent household equipment to low-income people, and their main customers were welfare recipients. For low-income people, the low rates this company offered for renting furniture, i.e., televisions, stereos, refrigerators, and all sorts of household appliances, were attractive, as most could not afford to buy such things. However, these items would take years to amortize, and in the end, people would end up paying 10 and even 20 times more than the item was actually worth. So in reality, my job title was simply a fancy title for a salvager. Basically, my job was to take items away from those people who defaulted on their payments, to put it simply. As you can imagine, this got me into some messy situations while doing my job. From a lady who fainted when I had to remove the TV from her living room, to a man who threatened to hit me with a kitchen hammer if I took his stereo. The scariest situation I experienced at that job, however, occurred when I was behind the store on a day off. It is important to keep in mind that these types of rental stores are usually located in lower-class neighborhoods, which tend to be problematic for the most part. However, strategically, they are also located near one of those payday loan stores or a popular on-site liquor store. Fortunately for us, the shopping plaza where we were located was not in such a bad area, but it was close to the mall under construction, and I had heard rumors that the huge parking lot was a breeding ground for criminal gang activity in the area, especially for sales of illicit substances, robberies, and arms trafficking. That day, I saw several police cruisers lighting up the parking lot, but I never really knew if it was simply drug busts or maybe just shoplifting by the addicts that abounded in the area. Being that this was my day off, the work office was the last place I wanted to be, but the crappy truck I was driving at the time had engine problems, so when my shift ended the night before, I was forced to leave it in the back of the store, and then a coworker gave me a ride home. However, that day I had to return to the store late in the morning, brought my tools and started working on the truck's engine, praying that I could find the fault and get it running again. That day I ended up getting there a little later than I would have liked. Fortunately, my old truck was tall enough that I didn't have to jack it up, so I just threw some cardboard on the ground and got to work right away. There were some preliminary things I had to do before I got to the real problem, so I didn't take things apart until almost late in the afternoon, and by then I still had quite a bit left to do. Hours passed, and before I knew it, the sun began to set. I don't remember exactly how long I was under the truck working, but I remember I was in the driver's seat trying to get it started, and as I got out to adjust a guaya, I heard running footsteps in the distance. I turned to where I heard the footsteps, and then I saw this skinny guy about 5'10" coming running straight at me. At the time, besides the immediate thought that this was actually a strange place to be out running, I didn't think much of it, and when he came up to me I just nodded and said hello. But when he looked me in the face, I was very surprised. The look this guy gave me was pure fear, more like panic. This guy wasn't jogging, he was running at full speed, clearly running away from something. He was a young man in his early 20s, and he didn't look bad at all. I stood there and watched him run towards the dumpsters and then disappear. While it wasn't entirely uncommon to see people in the back of the square, most of the time they were addicts and vagrants who were always hanging around, but this one didn't look like it, and I had never seen him before either. I tried to ignore him and decided to go back to work, but not even 30 seconds passed when I started to hear footsteps once again. Then I turn around and see another man running towards me, and as I got closer I realized that this man was bigger, and maybe in his 30s. He had a beard and was wearing a cap. There was something about him that was much more intimidating. I'm 6'4" and was in good shape then, and people used to say I looked intimidating, which was necessary in the job I was in. But it only took one look from this guy to know he wasn't someone I wanted to mess with. Suddenly, this man came up to me and yelled in my face, "Where is he? Where did he go?" I didn't even think about it. I quickly pointed towards the dumpsters, looking back. Then he told me to take him, and I obeyed. Don't ask me why, but there was something so imposing about this guy that I just felt I had to obey. I started heading towards the dumpsters that were maybe 25 meters away, with the bearded guy behind me, thinking now that this guy was already lost deep into the wooded area behind the dumpsters, so I just thought I'd point and go. But as we got closer, I noticed a figure crouched down behind me. I noticed a figure crouched behind one of them, and suddenly I heard them whisper to me, "Get out of here." But then I saw that the bearded man was now a few feet away from me, pointing a gun directly at the first guy, who had such a panicked expression that I will never forget. I stood there frozen, as if I couldn't process what was happening. The thin man behind the containers got up and walked hesitantly towards the bearded man, who grabbed him and immediately yelled, "Get on the ground," then threw him himself. I was still motionless, but was soon brought out of my state of shock by the sound of tires screeching at the opposite end of the square, perhaps 150 yards away. I turned to look, and a van was rounding the bend and headed straight for us at full speed. It was at this point that my brain reacted, and I ran towards my van and simply hid behind it. Then I saw when the van slammed on the brakes just a few feet away from a skinny guy on the ground, and two armed men jumped out of it, while another one jumped out of the back of it, and they all started yelling things at him. But I distinctly remember one of them repeating, "You fucked up, man, you fucked up." Two of the men grabbed the skinny guy and lifted him off the ground and dragged him to the back of the van at gunpoint and made him lie on his back. Then they climbed in. The bearded guy climbed up front in the front passenger seat, and two others climbed into the back of the van and stood there pointing at the head of the skinny guy lying on the bed, and then the van sped off and out of sight. I stood there in disbelief, wondering what the hell I just witnessed. It all happened so fast after the bearded man pulled out his gun that it all seemed to have been an illusion or a bad dream. I don't know. Who the hell were those guys? Members of some criminal organization? Maybe traffickers? Maybe they were even undercover DEA agents? I thought of all these possibilities, even that maybe they were cops. But they didn't announce themselves, nor did they wear handcuffs. But if they were criminals, surely they were from an organization, because common criminals I know they were not. All these thoughts were going through my head. I ran to the store to tell my co-workers what I had just witnessed. I honestly don't remember who was there that day, but I clearly remember two in specific. Carlos and Hannah, he was the store manager, and she was the administrator. I remember rushing in, almost hyperventilating from nerves, and when I told them everything that had just happened, they both said something like, "Oh, that's crazy," and went about their business. It was like they couldn't comprehend the severity of what really happened. It wasn't like they were completely ignoring it, but they didn't seem to be as shocked as I was. It was absolutely terrifying to me. So the difference in our reactions left me a little shocked. I had just witnessed what was possibly the last minutes of another human being's life, while they were simply more focused on closing up to go home. It then dawned on me that perhaps in that godforsaken place, everyone was so used to seeing this kind of thing on a daily basis that they had become very desensitized to it. After noticing their indifferent reactions, I regained my composure and went out again to finish working on my truck. About half an hour later, I saw two men walking slowly behind the dumpster area where the guy had previously been hiding. They started looking all over the place as if they were looking for something or someone. Then they moved further and started searching through the brush and so on, until they eventually got lost behind the dumpster and I didn't see them again. After that, I was working there for a while longer, almost a year, but after that I really didn't feel comfortable enough, so as soon as I got a better job, I decided to quit, and since then I never went back to that neighborhood. When I was 28 years old back in 2010, I used to work the night shift at the front desk of an apartment building. There, the lobby area had a desk, and I was in charge of giving people access, or not, to the building. I was essentially a security foreman, making sure that whoever came into the building lived there, or was a guest of someone, and for that, I needed the landlord's approval. I remember my shift was from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., so as you can imagine, there wasn't much action during my day, especially after midnight, just the occasional tenant coming in drunk after a good night. But that was only on some weekends, not always, as the people in this building were mostly office workers or employees of nearby businesses, as it was very close to a business park. However, there was one day that was definitely worth all those days when there was nothing to do. That night, I was in the middle of my shift trying not to fall asleep when I suddenly saw movement on one of the cameras in the garage. This was next to the building, but to enter you still needed to get to the main doors and of course for me to authorize access. However, at that moment someone was walking through the garage towards the stairs leading down to the lobby area. I had not seen anyone enter that area, but I was quite tired that day and perhaps I was careless. This person entered the garage and parked their car. I watched as the person entered the stairs and walked up towards the door to enter the lobby, and immediately pulled to open the door. Apparently this guy didn't know he had to be cleared by me. Through the glass I could see that it was a young person, a man around 30 years old. He looked back at me and motioned for me to open the door. It was clear that he did not live here, so I walked to the entrance, approached the door and indicated that I had to leave. The man began to explain that he was here to see his friend and needed to come in. I had received no warning about this guy, and there was no note indicating that he was supposed to be granted access to the building, so for me it was a no, and I let him know that. Upon seeing my refusal to let him in, the man looked at me angrily and insisted that he had to see his friend tonight, and when I once again told him I would not let him in, he started banging on the door and pawing on the other side. But as he waved his arms up and down, his sweater was briefly lifted, and I saw that he also had a gun tucked in his waistband. Realizing this, I was really worried. The last thing I wanted was for the guy to shoot me. But fortunately, this was safety glass and it was designed to not let bullets through. This was because this building belonged to a banker, and he took the security of his properties very seriously, and that night I couldn't have been more grateful for that. The guy, who I later noticed had a small black backpack that was hardly noticeable because it was camouflaged by his wide sweatshirt of the same color, began to lose his patience and then started to threaten me. I told him that if he didn't leave immediately, I would call the police. Then, when I again refused to open the door for him and threatened him with the police, the man drew his gun, and before I could react, he took 2 steps back and fired 3 shots against the glass in my direction. Honestly, at that moment, out of pure instinct, I covered my face and part of my torso with my forearms. But when I turned to look at him, I realized he was as surprised as I was shocked. I'm sure he had no idea the glass was bulletproof. I immediately ran to my desk, pulled out my phone and dialed the police, but when I turned to look, he was gone. So I peeked into the cameras and could see him running down the stairs. A few minutes later, the police arrived and I showed them the images captured by the security camera. They took my statement, a copy of the video, and set out to go around the vicinity looking for him. I honestly did not have much hope that they would find him, but they did. He was stopped by officers while speeding and by repeatedly ignoring the stop sign. The officers chased him for almost a mile until he finally decided to park the vehicle. It was later determined that it was the same man who shot me through the glass, and he was placed under arrest. But that's not the end of the story, because after searching his car, the police found duct tape, a household knife, a rope, and several black garbage bags inside a black backpack, just the one he was carrying that night. But what I learned later was really creepy. This guy turned out to be the ex-boyfriend of one of the tenants of the building, which was a man in his 30s who had moved in a couple of months ago with his partner, who was another guy in his 20s or 22s. And upon questioning, the suspect admitted that he had planned to enter the building that night and kill his ex and his ex's new partner. Last I heard, the guy was convicted of attempted manslaughter in frustration and is currently serving a prison sentence. After that, I couldn't stop thinking about how close this psychopath came to ending 3 lives that night, including mine. And that if it wasn't for the bulletproof glass, this story would have had a very different ending. Shortly after this incident, those tenants moved out, and I kept working there for 6 more months. But then I decided to quit, because after that night I started to have several episodes of stress. Almost every night I remembered what happened, and I could not have peace of mind. So for my mental health, I decided to look for another job. My name is Julian, and I currently live in the United States. A few years ago, when I was younger, I moved out of my parents' house and rented a property. At the time, expenses were pressing me, so I took a side job as an Uber driver, this on top of my full-time retail job. I was manning a counter and making sales, but this job just didn't offer me the pay I needed at the time, and I wasn't smart enough to simply look for a better job or negotiate a raise. At the time, it was the best I could find, and I didn't want to risk becoming unemployed. Instead, I did what many young workers do today, and got a second job. I was now living in a big city and driving the nicest car I had ever owned in my entire life. Plus, I always liked being on the road, as my dad used to be a truck driver, and I would ride with him from time to time, so working at Uber made a lot of sense in my mind. This was about 10 years ago, so the company had just launched successfully and was booming all over the country. You would hear about people making 6-figure salaries and all, just for driving people around their community. People who you would also talk to in passing and be entertained by. At the time, everyone told me the same thing. It was easy money that could be made hand over fist. I can't really tell you that's what I got out of this job. And while I was certainly making a decent amount, it wasn't that I was doubling my income like I thought I was, but I was making progress according to my expectations at the time. However, this also put me on a new level of physical and mental exhaustion, because I had to sacrifice sleep in order to have more productive Uber shifts. This meant that all the time I was leaving retail work around 6 in the evening, then eating anything fast, and then going to work Uber until 2 in the morning. Anything after that time, I quickly learned, was just riffraff. People you would not want to load in your car. And this was when Uber did not have the protocol it does now. No wonder some pretty bizarre things happened in the backseat of these cars. That night I was about 6 months into that new kind of job, and I had learned how to work double shifts, where the higher yield areas were, to pick up passengers, and how to make a quick turnaround on both drop-offs and go back to the downtown areas. There was one place in that center where I always used to park at break times, and which was strategically close to several of the most important areas of interest in the city to get customers. This was a hospital where I would take the opportunity to check my cell phone or grab a quick bite to eat, as well as use their Wi-Fi, this without having to worry about hustle and bustle of traffic. There were also several fast food joints and convenience stores nearby, all to keep me in the game while I took a few minutes when I needed it. Sometimes I was so exhausted that I would just stop there between services and just take a quick nap of about 10 or 15 minutes to replenish myself, so I wouldn't end up falling asleep while driving. Going back to that night, I found myself at the end of an exhaustive cycle. I was definitely on the verge of reaching my limit at that point. I did my usual routine where I went into the hospital while waiting for a client. It was an unusually slow night, and I was waiting. There were a lot of passengers, so I really didn't know what to do. I told myself I would make more money later that night, but for now I had to take a little break. So I went and bought an energy drink from a vending machine in the lobby, drank it in the car, and tried to stay awake sitting in the driver's seat. Then put on my favorite playlist. But sleep overcame me and I passed out right there. I wasn't asleep for long, but it was a catatonic, deep rest, when you fall into the arms of Morpheus with your mouth wide open, drooling and snoring. But while it was a necessary sleep, there is something about it that I really hate, and that is the feeling of waking up when I shouldn't have been asleep. That when my brain starts to overcompensate and I can't make any connections, I can't remember where I am, who I am, what I am, nothing, and just like that I woke up. When I was in the deepest of dreams, I started to feel uncomfortable because my head was at a weird angle. I did this kind of cat moan when I came back to the waking world, and then I realized that I was still inside my car. It was still dark, and the same playlist was blaring through the speakers. I looked at the clock and it turned out that I had only been asleep for about 15 minutes. I took a deep breath through my nose and then settled back in the seat. While it wasn't the longest nap in the world, it was restorative, I couldn't deny it. I checked my phone and saw that I didn't miss anything, but there was a customer nearby that I could approach and make a few bucks. So I took another swig of my Red Bull, looked around, and then at my rearview mirrors, and then stopped at that point because I saw that there was something wrong with my rearview mirror. If my eyes didn't deceive me, there was a person sitting right behind me in the middle seat. At that point we made eye contact and both of us were silent for a couple of seconds. I turned around and sure enough there was a man sitting less than 12 inches away. I noticed that he had a small smile on his face and simply nodded, as if he was acknowledging that he had been asleep. It almost seemed like a small greeting on his part. It was pretty scary, but I kept my composure before assuming anything, and was about to ask him what he was doing inside my car when I looked down and saw the Uber app open on his phone. I was parked in front of a hospital, so this guy must have come out of one of those buildings. Surely he was wandering around about to book a ride and his phone helped him find me. At that point I regained some coherence. This put an end to the panic, so I simply said, "Hello, what are you doing in my car?" He didn't respond. He just looked at the floor and then at the ceiling, anywhere but directly at me. Then he looked down at his phone, but didn't say anything, so I continued talking. "Are you looking for a ride or something?" I asked. Then he nodded, and that let me know he was at least halfway normal. I relaxed and reclined the seat a bit, then explained to him that I have 2 jobs, that I was pretty tired because I hadn't slept and that's why I fell asleep in the car. Then told him I would be happy to give him a ride wherever he told me in exchange for him not giving a bad review. I also didn't want him to say he found me asleep in the car. We laughed about that. Then he told me he was trying to get downtown, and I asked him exactly where, and he gave me some vague directions but told me it was very close to an old music bar that closed a few years ago. So I started driving and asked him his name. He told me his name was Edgard. We started to have a little talk and he told me that when he got in my car he went to talk, but at that he saw me snoring and decided to sit down and wait for me to wake up. I told him that I was thankful that he was not a weirdo, and I confessed to him that I was about to freak out before I saw the Uber app open on his phone. But just then I look at my phone and realize that I'm not actually logged in, and this guy never ordered a ride through the app, and I haven't signed up to pick anyone up. At that point I turned to where he was and said, "Hey, I just realized this ride is not registered. You can find me on the app real quick." And that's when the guy starts to scoff, then looks out the window and says he's not going to pay for it. I laughed thinking he meant it as a joke, but he seemed to have meant it. That's when I turned to him and detailed him for the first time. And at that moment I realized what a huge mistake I had made. This guy was not dressed like a professional or anything like that. He was dirty, his clothes were torn, and he only had 1 shoe. I could also see that he was pretty sunburned, and next to him was a dirty backpack, so I thought, this can't be true. So while I was sleeping, this homeless guy who was hanging around got into my car, and when I looked at him again, I noticed that he had a paper bracelet in his hand, the kind they put in the hospital to discharge the patient. That is, maybe this man overdosed behind a trash can, was treated at the hospital, and now he was getting a free ride back to his crack house. And all this for falling asleep like an idiot and not being able to keep my eyes wide open. Is that I still couldn't believe how I didn't realize I was a bum? It's this kind of thing I mean when I talk about that drowsy limbo state I have when I wake up all of a sudden. I shook my head from side to side and ran my hands over my face, put on my blinker and started turning my car around to the next exit. Noticing this, he asked me where I was going, so I said, "Don't even think I'm giving you a free ride across town. Be thankful I'm not calling the police." I pulled my phone out of my pocket and showed it to him so he could see I was serious. Then he replied, "And you're lucky I didn't pull the braids out of my shoes and strangle you with them while you were sleeping." And before I could react, I felt his hand scrape around my neck. I instinctively took my hand off the steering wheel and tried to let go, but I couldn't. All I could do was stick a finger under his palm and make a tiny space so I could breathe. Panic began to take hold of me as I watched almost a minute go by, and I couldn't get the guy off me. All this while driving down the avenue. Seeing that I was trying with all my might and could not release my neck from the grip of this man, who in addition to choking me was suffocating me with the disgusting smell he was emanating. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw that I was in a completely alone stretch of the road, so I slammed on the brakes. This sent Edgar hurtling forward as I was belted in, but he was not. Finally, my neck was free, so I took the opportunity to get as much air as I could. Then he tried to throw himself at me again, but this time I wasn't unprepared, so we started fighting inside the car. At one point, he punched me in the face, and I responded with another hard punch. Then he tried to grab my neck again, but I didn't let him. And while we were struggling, I managed to grab my phone and dial 911. When he saw that I called 911, he started threatening me and trying to snatch my phone, but he couldn't. And while he was yelling rude things at me, he started taking his stuff and got out of my car and started walking down the sidewalk ranting things against me. That's when I saw myself in the mirror and noticed blood coming out of my nose. And I also saw that I had bruises on my neck and some bruises on my face from the fight. After that, I went back to the hospital to get treated, and while they were treating me, I told the nurse that treated me about the incident, and then she looked at me with wide eyes and gave me the description of the man, asking if it was the same one. I said yes. Then she told me that this man had come to the hospital for an overdose a couple of days ago. But that night he had ripped out his tracks and ran away from the hospital but stole his wallet and cell phone. At that moment, something clicked in my head, and I realized that I had been really stupid. How could I not have thought of that? The cell phone that the homeless man had in his hands was this nurse, and for sure his stuff was in that old backpack. After that, I called 911 again and gave the report, since the first call was completely forgotten. I don't know if the nurse managed to get her stuff back, but from that day on, I kept my eyes peeled on my Uber nights. I work nights as a security officer. My job basically consists of traveling to various business buildings, whose owners hire the company where I work to provide security services. During my day, I stop by each of these buildings several times a night to make sure that nothing unusual is going on and that the place is safe. Honestly, my job is really boring and monotonous, as you can imagine. Nothing is more boring and lonelier than an office building at night, as there is literally no one there and nothing happens. And as for my job, well, I just have to walk around each entry point to the building to make sure it is locked and secure and nothing else. I have keys to all these buildings in case I need to enter. But in the 6 months I had working this night shift, I never had to enter a single building. However, everything changed during a shift I had 3 weeks ago. That night, I arrived at my third building, which was an administrative office building. This is one of the smaller ones, only 4 floors. Like every night, I made a couple of rounds around the perimeter of the building, shining my flashlight into the windows to make sure they were intact, also pulling the locks on the doors to make sure they were fully closed. I approached the main entrance and verified that it was properly locked, then went around the building to get to the back and do the same. This is always the last step of my check, to then continue with my tour of the night and the following properties. So by completing this step, I was ready to continue my journey, but the night had other plans for me. When I finally reached the back of the building, I checked the door, but to my surprise it was unlocked, and not only that, but it was also open. I stood still for a moment, This was the first time this had happened in all the time I had been in this job up to that point, so I had never had to deal with a situation like this before. However, I have been trained to deal with situations like this, therefore I knew very well what was the protocol I had to follow. I knew I had to enter the building, but I was a little nervous, as I did not know what I could find. I hoped that it was just an oversight of the employees, that there was a new person in the office who may have left quickly and forgot to close the door properly. But it was quite unlikely, because the owners of this particular complex were quite picky with the issue of security. Finally, I entered the building and maneuvered through the corridors, trying to move very slowly and shining my flashlight up and down each room, with special emphasis on the corners, under desks and behind shelves, which are the places an intruder would normally use to hide, but I found nothing. It took me quite a while, especially since I was nervous, but I went through the 4 floors of the building without seeing anything unusual. Everything seemed to be in order, so I went back to the door that had been left open, removed the fixture that is left as a warning that an inspection is being made, and closed it behind me, feeling relieved that it was nothing unusual. I continued my rounds for the night, going through the rest of the buildings that needed to be checked to cap off another successful day. But once I had confirmed that everything was in order at the other properties, I decided to return to the office building I had walked through earlier to make sure everything was okay. I took my truck to the parking lot, got out and walked around the building again. I wanted to do it one more time to make sure I left everything in perfect order, and I thought I was about to do it, but to my surprise, the same back exit was again unlocked and open. At this point, I was very confused, as I made sure to lock that door properly before going to the other properties, and there was not supposed to be anyone still in the building at this hour. Plus, the only people who had keys were the owner, the manager, and me. Once again, I entered the building. Inside, there were no lights on. Again, I began to check all the offices and looked up and down. This time I even called several times to see if anyone was there, but I did not see or hear anything unusual during my entire trip through the building. Once again, I returned to the back and saw that the door was now locked. I had not locked the door when I entered, but now the door was closed, and the brick that had been used to hold it open was not in sight this time. This was the first time I had to enter a building since I had this job, so I was a little scared at that point, and not for the least. It was clear that I was not alone there. I got ready to open the door to get out and then close it again. But when I tried to open it, I couldn't do it. I tried several times to pull the door because it opened inwards, but I couldn't. It was as if someone was holding it from the outside. I started to ask who was there, but nobody answered me, so I started to pull with all my strength, so that if someone was holding it, it would come with the impulse. But when I did it, I fell backwards, hitting the wall, and almost ended up on the floor, because whoever was holding the door let it go at that very moment. I quickly got up and ran outside, shining my flashlight, but I saw no one. I sharpened my hearing to see if I heard anyone running or anything, but I didn't hear anything. I was very confused, so I looked around again, and at that moment everything suddenly went dark. I instantly jumped in shock, but soon realized it was a blackout, not in the building, in the whole area. Everything around me went completely dark. Then I got really scared, so I closed the door as fast as I could and rushed back to the safety of my truck, started it up and got out of there as fast as I could, but not before sending a message to my boss to notify him of the incident. I called the office building the next day, asking if anything important was missing or had been stolen, but nothing. Everything was in order, and there was no indication that anyone had been there. That was really creepy, and I never knew what had happened that day, but it didn't happen again either, and to this day everything is normal. I was a cab driver for many years. That way I kept my home and was able to give my family a decent life. I remember that in those days I used to work late into the night, most of the time until the wee hours of the morning, and especially in the times when I had to pay my house, sometimes I used to wake up at dawn providing service. Fortunately, those were quieter times. I live in a tourist city in Mexico, so tourists were my main customers, mostly Americans who like to enjoy the nightlife of the city, and personally they were my favorite customers, as they always left me a good tip in dollars. Anyway, what I am about to tell you happened one of those nights when I was working late. By then it was after midnight. That night I had just dropped off a couple of tourists at a nearby hotel, and as I was putting my travel money in my wallet, I saw a man approaching my car. He came to my window and asked me if I was on duty at the time. With the good tip that my previous clients had left me, I had already made it through the night and was thinking of going home because I was really tired. But I didn't want to miss the opportunity to do this last service and earn a little extra, so I said yes. This was a tall, stocky, bearded guy in his late 30s or early 40s at most, but he didn't seem like a bad person, so I didn't feel distrustful. The moment I told him I was available, he told me to wait a few minutes. He would go get his wife. I said no problem. After about 5 minutes, I noticed that the man was indeed coming with a woman, but he was carrying her in his arms. The lady looked very thin, and I could tell she had some kind of illness or disability. However, she looked quite young, but she was asleep. I was surprised he didn't bring her in a wheelchair, but I didn't want to ask him why. That was none of my business. I was being paid to do a service, not to meddle in what I don't care about, so I didn't say anything. I drove down the avenue straight to the address the man gave me. He told me that they were going to his mother's house, hers, so that she could stay with her daughter for a couple of days since she had been in poor health, and he preferred her to be in her mother's care until she felt better. It was then when he told me that his wife had an illness that caused her a disability, and she could not walk, and he told me that that night she had been feeling a little bad and he had to give her medication, but that this medication made her sleep a lot. At that moment, I really felt sorry for that man. I figured it must not have been easy for him to see his wife in that situation. At that moment, I took a quick glance through the rearview mirror, and I could see that the lady was leaning on his shoulder, still asleep. During the whole trip, the woman did not wake up at any time, and when we were close to the place he indicated, we passed in front of a pharmacy, and then he asked me if I could stop for a moment there to buy medicine for his wife. I accepted without any problem, but I told him that the meter was still running, so he told me that he had no problem with that he would pay me the difference, but that it would only be a few minutes. I stayed in the car waiting while the man went into the pharmacy, but the minutes began to run and he did not appear, so I turned to his wife, waiting to see if she woke up, but she was still sound asleep. When about 15 minutes had passed and the man did not return, I tried to talk to the lady, trying to get her to wake up, but she did not. 10 more minutes passed and there was no sign of the man, so I got out of the car, went to the back seat and started trying to wake the lady up, but she would not wake up, until at one point she opened her eyes for a moment and said, "He is not coming back." And then she fell asleep again. At that moment I was equally confused as I was angry. What do you mean he is not coming back? I tried to wake the woman up again, but she remained asleep. Seeing that she didn't react, I walked to the pharmacy to go look for her husband, and when I entered the place I gave the description of the man to the clerk and asked her if she had seen him. She said yes, but that he had bought a pack of cookies and left. That left me even more confused. What kind of guy was this? How does he leave his sick wife alone with a perfect stranger? I was very angry and at the same time desperate. I didn't know exactly what to do, so I went back to the car and once again tried to make the woman wake up again, but she didn't. And even worse, when I touched her, I realized she was cold, and when I turned on the car light, I noticed the whitish color of her skin. I immediately raised her hand and tried to take her pulse, but there was nothing. Then I put my fingers on her neck and nothing, there was no pulse. That woman had passed away. At that moment I started to feel a knot in my stomach. I put my hands on my head and started pacing back and forth and pacing around, thinking about the magnitude of the mess I was in. That lady had died in my cab, and her husband had completely disappeared. When I finally had a moment of lucidity, I did the only thing I thought sensible in these cases. I called the police. When the officers arrived, an ambulance took the lady's body away, while I accompanied the policeman to the nearest headquarters to make a statement. Once there, they began to ask me questions, as is normal in this type of situation. I was very nervous, because I knew I was the main suspect, or at least I thought so, but I explained to them in detail everything that happened that night where I picked them up, what the man told me, the condition of the lady, the pharmacy where I left him, everything in detail. And I also told them that the lady herself was the one who told me that he was not coming back. At that moment they looked at each other because there were two agents interrogating me, Then one of them asked me to explain exactly what the lady told me and when. I explained that at the moment I saw that her husband was not coming back, I tried to wake her up, and at one point she came to, opened her eyes and told me that he was not coming back, and it was at that moment when I went to look for him and I knew that she was right. They looked at each other again, and it was then that they told me that it was impossible, because that lady had been dead for at least 7 hours. At that moment I was cold, but I told them that maybe she was attended by a bad coroner, because I was absolutely sure that this woman opened her eyes and told me that her husband was not coming back, and I was as sure as I was that the woman had blue eyes. The cops were quite surprised and as confused as I was, as I'm sure at that point they knew I wasn't lying about anything I said. Cops are good at detecting that. The agents kept me there until the morning, when they finally found the whereabouts of that guy, who turned out to be her husband, but apparently he was in a state of shock or something. It seems that the death of his wife affected his judgment, but he did corroborate to the cops that his wife had died at 6 in the evening, and said he just did not know what to do with her body, and that is why he did what he did. He said he did not want to see her like that, dead. This really shocked me, because I am absolutely sure that this woman opened her eyes and spoke to me, and in fact, her eyes were blue. Her husband confirmed it, and then the coroner confirmed it. The autopsy showed that the lady had died of natural causes, of complications derived from her illness, so her husband should not have been charged with homicide or anything. But I did hear talk that he might have to go to psychological therapy. After everything was cleared up, I was finally able to go home, but after that, I was really very affected, that whole situation. Plus the fact that that woman spoke to me while she was dead was something I could not get out of my head, and the truth is that it took me a long time to get over it. Currently, I no longer work as a cab driver. Now I have my own business selling spare parts, and that is my main livelihood, and that of my family. But I will never forget my years as a professional driver, and all the anecdotes I have from that time in my life. But without a doubt, this has been the most chilling experience I experienced in my years as a night cab driver. About 10 years ago, when I was 40, I got a job at a mall as a janitor. My job was to clean the mall after it closed for the night, so that it would wake up clean the next day. Most of my nights were spent cleaning the food court areas, as well as taking care of the restrooms and cleaning the entrances to the stores. One night, I was sweeping the floor in the food court area when I heard a coughing fit coming from somewhere. I looked around the area where I was, which was dimly lit, but saw no one. At that moment, I didn't think of anything supernatural, because I remembered that during the years I was working there, on a couple of occasions I got to discover someone or a group of people who had hidden in the mall and were doing the dare to spend the night there, so I assumed that this might be the case. But it was. I didn't see anyone and didn't hear any more noise, so I kept cleaning. I figured that if anyone tried to stay in the mall overnight, I would eventually see them at some point, unless they stayed in one place for the entire time. About 15 minutes had passed and I was clearing the tables. Now, suddenly, a series of loud bangs startled me. I looked up and saw that there was a table lying on the floor, and all around me chairs had been knocked to the floor. I walked in disbelief towards the objects on the floor. This had happened near the edge of the food court. No one was anywhere to be seen, so I ventured a little further into the courtyard to see if I could spot anyone running away or trying to hide, but nothing. I was about to head back to the food court when suddenly I heard water running inside the women's restroom. All the bathrooms in the mall had sinks that had motion sensors, so that alone meant someone was inside the bathroom, and I had a feeling it was the culprit I was looking for. I slowly and quietly entered the women's restroom, and as I rounded the corner to the sink location, the water abruptly stopped running, but no one was there. I thoroughly checked the whole place, every cubicle, and found no one. So I chalked it up to a faulty sensor and decided to put in a work order for maintenance to come fix it as soon as possible. Strangely enough, however, as I was walking away from the bathroom, I again heard one of the faucets in the sink area turn on. This time I decided not to go back into the bathroom. Instead, I returned to the food court very confused and also a little scared. I spent the rest of the night as usual finishing my cleaning chores, trying not to dwell too much on the events of that night. A couple of days later, I received an email from the maintenance department who told me that there was nothing wrong with the sink sensor and that it was working normally. From then on, at least once a week, I would hear the water running from the sink in that bathroom. For the rest of the time I worked at the mall, I simply accepted that I was not alone in that mall at night, and both I and the coworker who covered that shift on weekends stayed away from that location. I never had any more incidents, like the one the day they knocked over all the chairs and tables in the food court. Fortunately, that spirit or whatever it was that inhabited that mall apparently decided to stay in the women's restroom forever. Hello, my name is Cecil. I am 35 years old and I have been working in the public library for about 8 years. The library in my town is quite large and beautiful. Half of it is all glass and the other half is that beautiful wood color that is so relaxing to look at. And speaking of relaxing, working in a library is definitely the most comfortable job I've ever had. We are on duty from 8 in the morning until 8 in the evening, and after that time, I get to organize the books until 10 o'clock and then I go home. Normally it only takes one person to stay until 10 p.m., and since I live alone and get bored at home, I always volunteer to stay to cover that shift. Plus, I get paid extra for it. However, a few months ago I had one of the scariest experiences of my life, just while I was staying the night shift. This was a particularly slow Monday. It was 8 o'clock at night and it was time to close. I said goodbye to my classmates as I did every day, and once they went home I stayed inside the building to organize the books as usual. As I began to place the books on the corresponding shelves, I took my time to place them carefully and leaf through them to make sure that none of them had suffered any damage. All this while I relaxed listening to some Adele. Fortunately, now organizing books is not such a difficult job, since we have a slot at the side of the building that collects the books of those users who do not want to enter, but need to return some. And then these are deposited in a kind of tub from where I take them out and place them where they belong. So that day I simply took the tub containing all the books that were returned and checked them one by one, also the digital catalog, to make sure they are all registered there. This process is as easy as rescanning the book, but our scanner was broken for the last month. It's funny how a library with such a nice modern facade has had a broken scanner for months, and the city just doesn't want to replace it in the short time it deserves. However, that never stopped me from doing my work, it just slowed it down, but let's just say I was getting used to it. However, this meant that I had to stay a little later than 10, an extra half hour, but I would do that organization no matter how long it took me. As I was looking in the garbage can I had just dragged to reception, a sound loudly caught my attention. It was the sound of the glass doors at the entrance opening and closing, which reminded me that, like a complete idiot, I had forgotten to close the front doors when my colleagues left. I'm an incredibly forgetful person, but when I forget to lock the doors and someone comes in, it's as easy as saying, "Sorry, but we're closed." Most people don't object to that, so it's usually no problem. But when I looked toward the front doors to tell whoever came in that the library was closed, I didn't see anyone there. It was as if the door had opened on its own, or as if someone I didn't catch a glimpse of had simply walked in without noticing the schedules hanging outside, but upon opening, perhaps realized we were closed and walked back out. At that point I shrugged, assuming that this had been the case, and continued doing the work I had left half done a moment ago. However, I kept an eye out just in case I saw any movement that might give away that someone had snuck inside the building. That wouldn't be unheard of either, as on several occasions kids from the local middle and high school tried to sneak in and spend the night inside the library. I really didn't understand why they kept doing that, until I saw the same thing being done at TikTok. It was like one of those challenges that goes viral and all the kids want to replicate it. I also saw that there were people hiding behind the shelves at Walmart to spend the night without the employees knowing, and various things like that. And maybe it can be fun to watch, but young people should know that doing that is illegal. Not to mention it could be potentially dangerous. Plus, Walmart is different. Most of those stores stay open 24/7, but not the library. It's already closed at 8, and if any kid refuses to leave, then I have to stay until I make sure they're gone. Anyway, the thing is, that kind of nonsense just causes trouble. A few minutes later, I had started dividing the books into different categories, when suddenly I heard footsteps coming from the history section. I turned my head to look in that direction, but a decorative pillar prevented me from seeing widely. I sighed in annoyance and stood up. I would definitely have to go investigate. The history section is on the first floor and consists of several different hallways, but it didn't take me long to look through each of them. There was no one there. So I went back to the reception, and just before I sat back down in my chair, I heard a different sound, one that honestly scared me a little. It sounded like a whisper, like someone mumbling quickly under their breath, not wanting to be heard, but also not wanting to keep it to themselves apparently. It was then that I began to have a suspicion that there was a ghost. Not that I'm exactly superstitious, but on a couple of occasions I was able to witness paranormal events. And since then I'm pretty open to the subject, although in this case I hadn't heard any ghost stories from my co-workers until now. So I never assumed that the library could be haunted. Although, to be honest, I was really ready to assume that. However, first I had to make 100% sure that the cause of those whispers wasn't earthly, that being honest, that could turn out to be scarier. Following the direction of the whispers, I went to the opposite wall and clicked on the overhead lights, then went upstairs and called out loudly so that anyone who might be there would know that the library was closed and that I should have left. But I wouldn't even need to say that, as the doors were already closed. Besides, it was almost 11 p.m. I knocked twice and still no one answered. No one moved either, until I reached the top of the stairs, where I suddenly heard rapid footsteps moving away from me. It sounded like they were coming from the flight of steps opposite this one. I won't deny that I felt a little scared at that moment. Although my main hypothesis was that it was a brat trying to do a stupid TikTok challenge, there was also the possibility that it was a potentially dangerous intruder, or as I said before, a ghost. That was my last option, but it was still on the table. I walked between the corridors to the end, checking each one carefully before slowly making my way to the other flight of steps. After seeing nothing strange or out of the ordinary up there, I used the next flight of steps to descend back down to the lower floor, but on the third step from the top, I managed to catch sight of something on the floor that chilled me to the bone. I gasped audibly when I realized it was blood. At that instant, a shiver began to run down my spine. I began to question if this was really happening. I wondered, what is this? A robbery? A vengeful ghost? Or a nosebleed that someone had earlier that day and never cleaned up? Or what the hell? Stupid as it sounds, I went with that idea. I mean, someone had a nosebleed, it would explain the blood on the floor, but definitely not the whispers. But since I couldn't find anyone, those I chalked up to the library ghost, which was making its debut that night. I continued down the stairs, making a mental note that after the books were organized, I would have to go clean up that blood. But as I got closer, I noticed that that blood appeared to be fresh. I thought I'd leave it in the back of my mind, so I went back to the front desk. I tried to shout a warning one more time, but there was no response. I sat at the desk, finishing the part of separating books into categories before placing them on their proper shelves. After finally completing that task, I returned to my desk and double-checked the computer, where I simply typed in a list of the books that were returned and left a note that none had been damaged. When the information was complete, I confirmed the entry, and almost at the exact moment I clicked confirm, the murmuring started again. But this time, it was right behind me. At that moment, I stood completely still, paralyzed. I was so shocked and terrified, I didn't want to turn around at all. I just wanted to pretend it wasn't happening. But it was happening, and it was the moment of truth. The moment to know which of the hypotheses was correct. so I decided to do it all at once. With a quick movement, I jumped out of my chair and turned around in a split second, and then all I see behind me is a big dark silhouette crossing from the left aisle to the right. It was definitely a man, and a flesh and blood one at that. I stumbled backwards looking for the phone on the desk and luckily found it. I held it up to my ear and then turned around to dial 911. An operator answered and I let them know that someone was in the library, possibly injured. They told me they would send someone as soon as possible and wanted me to stay on the line. But since the desk phone was actually a corded phone and I didn't want to be tied to one place, I told them I was going to hang up and wait at the front door. I had a cell phone, and if I had any more problems I could call them back, so I hung up the library phone. I was very nervous now. I didn't know who this man was or if he was hurt. Surely he was because of the blood, but I was terrified. I walked to the wall where the light switches were again, this time turning on all the lights in the building, and stood at the front desk. Yes, one should be running out of the library at that moment, but believe it or not, I felt too scared to move. All I could think was, why did someone sneak in here like that? Why was he mumbling like a madman? And what was all that blood? As I was processing all that information, I gradually realized that I should get out of there as soon as possible, because it was quite possible that I was in real danger. But just as I was about to do so, I heard more whispers. But this time they were coming from upstairs. One thing I didn't tell you about the library is that it has balconies, and the reason I make this remark is because just at that moment I felt a huge weight fall on top of me, and I was crushed against the wooden floor. A horrible wave of pain flowed through my whole body. I felt as if I had been crushed like a cockroach with a giant shoe, and a moment later, a sharp and deep burning sensation exploded in my left shoulder blade. Feeling that horrible pain, I kicked, screamed, and punched as hard as I could, and somehow, I was able to free myself from the weight of this person on me. Once I did, I stood up and ran backwards. Then a large man stood up shaking and violently muttering some kind of nonsense to himself under his breath. Instead of staring at me, the man looked in all directions and then back at me suddenly, as if he was delirious. This man was clearly deranged, or maybe he was on some kind of drug. But that didn't matter to me because I knew I was now in grave danger. Pain still coursed through my body like a bunch of wasps constantly stinging my back. But I got up anyway and ran for the side door. This one wasn't as close as the front door, but in that direction there wouldn't be a deranged, homeless-looking man attacking me. I ran out to the door, quickly opened it, and continued running to the street, almost accidentally taking a police officer head-on. I heard him curse and look over my shoulder, wondering if I was okay. I told him about the man who was there, that he had attacked me, and that he seemed crazed. The officers quickly entered the building, where they searched the entire area, second floor and second floor, every hallway, every point in between, but somehow found nothing but the blood stain on that step I had first seen, and my own blood on the floor of the lobby. And it was only at that moment that I realized that the crazed man had stabbed me in the left shoulder blade with a steak knife. Fortunately, I didn't suffer much more than bruises and a few stitches, but I was going to recover, at least physically. But mentally, I was unstable for a long time. Since that encounter, I started having anxiety attacks, and I couldn't feel safe in any way, no matter if I was at home or somewhere else. That man, whoever he was, did a lot of psychological damage to me. Once the police swept the place, one of them came out to stay with me, called an ambulance, and then tried to comfort me by letting me know what he thought of the person who attacked me, because he assumed it was probably someone on drugs. He said that people in these places take a certain kind of drug that can make them see things that are not there. I didn't know whether to feel sorry or angry. We live in a very nice and fairly safe city, and I found it very unfortunate that these types of people are running around, being a danger to the citizens. Fortunately, this man stabbed me in an area of my body that was not life-threatening, but he could well have punctured my heart, lungs, or some other important organ. Thank God that was not the case. After this incident, I was given 2 weeks of paid time off at the library to heal and try to get back to normal. I still work there, and from that day on, we never heard anything more from that man. meaning he was never caught. But for the next few months, we had a police officer who stayed there with us until everyone left, making sure everyone was okay. I think that might be the only reason I never quit. About 4 years ago, I worked as a barista at a locally owned coffee shop, which is also a very popular place for artists and musicians in town, as they usually host all kinds of small-time gigs there. Even today, the business makes most of its income due to open mic nights and is open to the public until 3 a.m. However, when I worked at that venue in 2018, it was open 24 hours a day, Thursday through Sunday. I remember all my coworkers at the time hated working the night shift, and I was no exception because while the tips were very good and the night shift pay was quite a bit better, I hated having to be alone and run the only place that was still open in the area. For many, the store was located in a good part of town, but it was also quite close to one of the dangerous areas, and this was another issue, because there really is no good side to the city during these hours of the night. That is, if we are being completely honest. I was advised never to keep more than $50 in the drawer during the night shift, and judging by the type of people that roam the alleys of the city in the wee hours of the morning, my biggest fear was that some drug addict or random criminal would one night drag me into the back of the store and hurt me. The truth is, during the early hours of the shift, something like between 7 p.m. and 11 p.m., the area was pretty vibrant and there was a lot of traffic, and in general the night moved well. But after that time, the place was completely desolate, and most of the people you saw on the street were not exactly people you want to have a one-on-one encounter with. It is for this reason that every time I was scheduled for the evening shift, I would ask one of my friends to come hang out with me. This was Chris, and he was probably someone I counted on with my eyes closed for these things since, besides, he really liked the nightlife scene, so he had no problem staying up all night, but I always had beer or some other alcoholic beverage for him, since he liked to drink. Chris had had some problems in the past with substance abuse, and while I would not dare to say that he was completely clean, the truth is that he was trying hard to stay away from drugs. But that is not as easy as people think. The thing is, that day it was a good time for me. I had just gotten my paycheck, and earlier I had received good money for my old pickup truck, which Chiz did me the favor of negotiating with the client and doing the transaction for me while I was at work. The last few months I had been working hard, as I had intended to buy a new car, so I had some money saved up. That night, I decided to buy my friend a nice bottle of whiskey and intended to compensate him monetarily for his support. It wouldn't be too much as I couldn't afford it, but something with which he could buy clothes or whatever he wanted. That night, I passed him a few beers under the table while there were a couple of customers, and of course I felt much more comfortable not being alone on shift, as it was a Wednesday, a particularly lonely day in the evenings. Chris was working on his laptop while I was busy, and we talked. Things were slow. We had been friends for a few years. We became very close after spending a lot of time together at my old job. It was always platonic, although Chris was also friends with many of my coworkers, and we always joked that he knew a lot about coffee and that he could work there too. But he always laughed and said he had better things to do in his photography studio. Even though we had known each other for quite some time, our friendship was not perfect, and we had had a few disagreements in the past, especially because of his addictions, since on a couple of occasions he even stole money from me to buy drugs, and whenever I told him about his addiction problems and that he should get help, he would get defensive and take it as if I thought I was better than him. Anyway, the usual with addicts when they don't want to assume their situation. But fortunately, after his rehab we talked about it. He apologized for many of the things he did and said, and so did I for being so hard. And since then all that was behind me, or so I thought, because I really didn't believe that there was some repressed grudge or something like that. But I was wrong, very wrong. That night Chris could not stay until the morning, because he had arranged to meet a girl or something like that, the case that he left at about 10 p.m. when Angela and Martin, two of my colleagues, were still in the place, but after an hour they also left, and in the end I had to stay alone in the shift, something I always hated, but I had no other choice. When it was about 2 a.m., the street was desolate as well as the place, something quite normal on a Wednesday. I was putting a batch of coffee on the list, when out of the corner of my eye I saw a figure pass by the front window. I looked over, but no one was there. I waited for someone to come to the back door, which customers could also use, but a minute had passed and no one was stuck by the cash register. I waited for a few more minutes, but after no one showed up, I decided it was time to mop the floors, so I went to the back to fill the mop bucket, and as soon as I turned on the faucet, I heard someone come in the front door. I yelled out that I would be with him in just a minute and then finished filling. I grabbed the bucket and rolled it behind the counter, and when I got there, whoever had come in had disappeared. I shrugged, thinking they had gone straight to the bathroom, and then started mopping behind the counter, but I could feel a strange feeling hovering over me, though I couldn't decipher what it was. But somehow, I knew something was wrong. The first thing I looked at was the drawer, but it hadn't been broken into yet. That would have been loud enough for me to hear it over the running water from the faucet. I leaned over the counter and checked the bathroom doors. Both were closed. But in the men's room, the light was on, so I knew someone was in there. My stomach churned slightly because I knew it was a man, but so far I had no real reason to think anything was wrong with him, so I kept mopping the floor. When I finally finished behind the counter, the bathroom door opened and, to my surprise, Chris stepped out. I immediately felt a sense of relief, but I had to ask him what he was doing in there, and he explained that he had just arrived, that he didn't do well on the date, and decided to come and join me. This made me feel very grateful for my friend, so I told him he could have whatever he wanted for free. It was on the house. I stood behind the espresso machine and started making a cappuccino for him, because I knew he liked it, at which point I turned to say something to him, but whatever he was thinking of saying was immediately forgotten. His facial expression had gone from friendly to devilish in just a moment, and suddenly a wave of shivers went through my body as I could notice something else. Now that I had him facing me, I could see that his eyes were very red, glassy, and empty. He was drugged. "What are you doing?" I asked, counterattacking, a little scared. Chris grinned like a psychopath and pulled a knife from behind his back. "It's finally time to settle the score, my friend," he said as he started laughing. "What the hell is wrong with you, Chris? Have you lost your mind? Put that knife down." I told him as a shiver began to run up my back because I knew he wasn't playing around. I knew him well enough to recognize when he was lying, and I knew that unhinged expression was true, plus I had witnessed one of his psychotic episodes after getting high before. "Chris, we're friends. Put down that knife, please," I repeated, but he just started laughing like a madman and walking forward, forcing me to back away. He told me that was exactly why no one would suspect him, because people knew we were friends. These words made my stomach sink. "There are cameras here, Chiz," I reminded him, but then he continued to laugh out loud and told me that he had disconnected them before he left. This really surprised me, because up to that point I thought what he was doing was a product of the crap he had gotten into, but when he left the premises earlier, he was sober, and we chatted most normally and amicably as usual. Then a question came to my mind: how long had he been planning this? I couldn't help myself, and asked him straight out. Then he looked at me with an expression of hatred I had never seen on his face before, and told me he was sick of me, and of me thinking I was better than him, of me treating him like a pathetic junkie. This as he brought the huge butcher knife close to my chest and forced me back towards the back of the store. My throat began to close up. It was also at this point that I looked for an exit and realized that I had locked both doors and turned off the open sign, preventing anyone from entering. Chris continued to get closer and closer. He is a tall and stout guy, much bigger than me and definitely stronger. I would never be a match for him in a hand-to-hand fight, let alone being unarmed. I screamed in desperation, looking for something to defend myself, trying not to slip on the wet floor. "Shut up," he yelled at me, and then told me to give him the money I had collected at the company and the money from the truck I had sold. There was no way I could refuse, since he himself had given me the money for the truck in cash when he came earlier, because he was the one who made that transaction. And he also knew that I collected my paycheck in cash. The last hope I had was that the bag with the money was on the counter, and this gave me a small chance of being able to find something there with which I could defend myself, or at least use it as a distraction while looking for an escape route. We went up to the counter, him pressing the knife the whole time. There I grabbed the bag and handed it to him, but at the last minute before he pushed me out of sight towards the back of the store, I grabbed the panini press and ripped it off the table, slamming the corner of the metal against the side of his head. He tried to block me and cut my arm in the process, but I connected the blow, and combined with the water on the floor that was still wet from the mop, the blow knocked him down. I took advantage of that gap and jumped over the counter in a split second and ran out the back door to the car as I locked myself in and called the police. It wasn't until I thought about leaving that I realized Chris had parked his car in front of mine deliberately to keep me from running away. The bastard had thought of everything. Moments later, as I was on the phone with the operator, he got out and made his way to my car. But then I ran out and started yelling for help. Fortunately, a police car just happened to be coming down the street, which made Chris stop following me and run away. The cops tended to my wound, and I gave them my statement about what happened without leaving out a single detail. I was still in shock and could hardly believe what had happened. It turned out that he was serious about the cameras. Yes, he had disconnected them, but I had no idea that he even knew how to do it. That just tells me that he planned this well in advance, and had he carried it out as he wanted, it would have been the perfect crime, since he was my friend and no one would suspect. Plus, everyone saw him leave that night after accompanying me. Chiz was very close to finishing me off in a really cunning way, and most probably my death would have gone unpunished. I could even imagine him going to my house and condoling with my parents for my death, while he spent my money on drugs. The next day, Chris was arrested and later sentenced to 6 years in prison for what he did. To me, it was a very small sentence for someone who premeditated a crime so viciously, and against someone I used to consider him as a brother. Chris's betrayal taught me a great lesson about keeping my eyes wide open with all those people who claimed to be my friends, and it also taught me to be well aware of all those little signs that I completely ignored with him. Fortunately, I was able to get my money back and I finally bought my new car. As for work, I continued to work there, but I never wanted to cover the night shift ever again. It was a snowy night when I parked my car in the parking lot of the gas station where I worked the 11:00 to 7:00 night shift. I had been working at this location for several months. The truth is that I didn't really like this job, but it was hard for me to find a better one. And due to some circumstances in my life, the night shift was the one that best fit my personal schedule. However, every night I came to work feeling exhausted and fatigued, struggling to finish each shift. That particular one, I parked my car in front of the building next to the only other car in the parking lot, which belonged to my coworker, who was supposed to deliver my shift to me. I went in and received the inventory and cash register closing, so I got ready to start the day as I do every night. He stayed for a few minutes and then left, so I was on my own for the rest of the night. When I got to my desk, I noticed that the manager had left me a piece of paper there, which had some instructions and things to do written on it, but after reading it, I realized that it was no big deal. My estimate was that it wouldn't take more than an hour in total to complete all the tasks, so I tried to delay as much as possible to avoid falling asleep, as I started to feel very tired, something that was already common. However, as I sat behind my desk around midnight, a car pulled into the station. I looked out the window and saw an old pickup truck parked at one of the pumps. It was snowing outside that day, so most people weren't driving, but it was common to get a customer from time to time in these conditions. I went back to my phone and checked some videos without paying much attention to the person outside the gas station. About 15 minutes passed, and then I looked outside again and noticed that the van was still there by the pump. Its headlights were off and its door was closed, nothing strange. It looked like it was just pumping gas, but it had been there for too long. That's when I decided to get up and walk over. I walked over to the window of the service building and looked both ways, but there was no one outside. This worried me a little because if anyone had been inside the car for the last 15 minutes with the engine off, they would surely be freezing because it was snowing heavily outside and it was windy. I honestly started to feel quite worried. I paid more attention for the next few minutes, hoping to see some kind of movement through the window or that someone would come back inside his car. But absolutely nothing happened. It was as if the car had simply been abandoned by its owner at the gas station. After watching for about 15 more minutes without seeing anything happen, I went back to my desk, grabbed my jacket that was resting on the back of my chair, quickly put it on and went outside immediately. As soon as I stepped foot outside, I knew I was right about my worries. It was too cold for anyone to be inside a car with the engine off, or even to be outside for more than a few minutes. I crawled into the car and looked around, then put my face up to the window and tried to look inside the van. "Hello? Is anyone here?" I called out, just to check if anyone was there and if I was okay. However, I got no answer, and as far as I could see, there was no one inside the car either, although it wasn't easy to see clearly because of the snow. Maybe there could be someone inside, but I was pretty sure there was not. I was very confused. I stepped back and looked around the empty parking lot of the gas station before I started walking back to the building, and when I did, something caught my attention. And now without my eyes were no longer focused on the car, but the ground. I saw shoe prints in the snow leading towards the building, not to the front of the building but a little to the side. I looked back and saw that they appeared to be coming from the car, but at that point I froze and didn't want to investigate further without warming up a bit first. I went back inside and turned on the small heater next to the cashier's desk, putting my hands in front of it to get rid of some of the cold. I was only on for about a minute before a loud sound echoed throughout the building behind me. It sounded like a bunch of boxes falling to the floor. I turned around and saw nothing, then walked around the desk and to my horror, saw that behind me on the floor was a puddle of melted, dirty snow, which came from someone's shoes. I felt very cold at that moment, but so I walked to the back room and turned to the corner where the storage room was. And that's when I could see a figure standing in the dark, behind one of the shelves. It was the silhouette of someone, a tall, broad-shouldered man. He had a thick beard and was looking directly at me. At that moment, my heart skipped a beat. I was completely paralyzed for an instant, but after the initial shock, my reaction was to simply walk back to the checkout counter and stand there. I don't know why I did that. Perhaps I was too shocked to react properly. After staring at the store door for I don't know how long, completely mute, I picked up the store phone and called the police. At that point, I felt like my voice wasn't even coming out, and I couldn't speak loud enough to not be heard by the stranger either. So I practically called for help in a whisper and with bated breath. And after that, I went through the most stressful 10 to 15 minutes of my entire life. While waiting during this time, I didn't hear or see anything from the storage room, which honestly increased my fear somewhat. The man never came out to confront me, but he also never spoke to me or justified himself in any way. And when 2 police officers finally arrived and came in, I quietly told them where the man was. They searched the room while I stayed in front, but I was surprised when they left without anyone else, as the man had apparently already left. Dirty shoe prints circled the back door, but instead of heading towards the pump where the van was, they went straight towards the long, dark, empty field that continued at the back of the station. But that wasn't the strangest thing. But when I looked toward the pump, the old van was gone, but I didn't hear it start up or see anyone get in it either. It was just too strange. On the other hand, at that hour and in that weather, it was almost impossible for anyone to get through that snow-covered field without freezing. Nothing made sense, and I never heard from that strange guy again, or whatever he was. In 2017, I found my dream job as the manager of a very old rustic pub. It was the kind that had 1930s stained glass windows and bar fixtures, but after a few months the owners decided to sell it to a big brewing company, so I ended up unemployed again. It really was a disappointment, as just 6 months after getting my dream job, I lost it again, and without warning. I was desperate at the time. I had rent due and a lot of bills to pay, so I was ready to work anywhere, at anything and doing anything for any salary. That's how I ended up getting a job at this license store in the middle of town. My job was on the night shift, coming in at 8 p.m. and leaving at 6 a.m. It was a hard day's work, and it deprived me of a lot of time. It was a hard day and completely deprived me of my night's sleep, but it was the first thing I found and it helped me pay off my debts, which had me completely suffocated. This place was also very busy, had an ATM in the middle of the store, sold very expensive bottles of premium alcohol, and the business was completely cash only. It was the place where almost everyone who went out drinking on the weekends and wanted to keep the party going after the bars closed would stop to pick up a few bottles before taking a cab home. So I'm not lying when I say that sometimes we had about $7,000 in cash in the till at the end of the night, and, well, when I say we, I mean myself. Since on that shift I was working completely alone. One Sunday morning around 5 o'clock, just the day before Christmas, the day had been very busy that night and we had over $6,000 in the place. It was as if it had been a Black Friday, as there were parties everywhere in the city that day, and as it usually happens around this time, people just had no intention of ending the revelry. They all wanted to continue owing alcohol, so they bought their bottles to go and continue partying at home or somewhere else. That night the day was really exhausting, I mean it. It was one of the busiest shifts I had, and all the time I'd been working at the place it was just me attending to about 20 people at the same time. At one point I had to stand behind the shelf and start doing breathing exercises, because I was really about to collapse. By the time it was almost dawn and finally the flow of customers naturally slowed down, I remember leaning my head on the counter at one point, thinking I could have fallen asleep right then and there. And then I heard the little beep on the door as it opened. And although I would rather have dunked my own head into the toilet than serve another drunk customer, I had no choice. I had to serve him. I lifted my head from the counter, dead tired. And then I saw this guy, clean, well-groomed, well-dressed, and, above all, sober. Alarmingly sober. The reason this caught my attention so much is because most people who come to this place on a Saturday late at night and the wee hours of the morning are usually rotten drunk, glassy-eyed and bloodshot, slurring their words and smelling like demons. But this guy was surprisingly lucid, which was very strange. He also kept his hands in his jacket pockets the whole time while talking, but things got even stranger when he greeted me by name. I thought he might have done it simply because he knew me, and at the time, and in the exhausted state I was in, I didn't recognize him. So I remained polite and said, "Yes, that's me. How do you know that?" He then once again refers to me by name and goes on to tell me where I live. Obviously this much stranger, and I found it a bit alarming. The first thing that came to my mind is that this was a plainclothes cop or something like that. And maybe I've done something like accidentally selling a bottle of alcohol to someone under 18 or something like that. The truth is that I was waiting for him to tell me something about that guy. But then, the man started asking about my mom, and he referred to her by name. Then he asked about my sister, and he also knew her name. The guy asked me if they still lived in such and such neighborhood, and he gave me their exact address. When I heard that, I apologized, thinking that maybe he was an old family friend, and I didn't recognize him. But there was something about him that scared me. I didn't really know what, since he was never aggressive, and from the things he was telling me, I was probably right in thinking he was someone I knew from the past. One of the things that made me nervous is that while he was talking to me, the man never once took his hands out of his jacket pockets. And this really struck me as odd, strange, and suspicious. That's when these other two men came in who also seemed strangely sober, looked quiet and deliberate in their movements, just walking up to the counter and flanking the guy who seemed to know too much about me. And then, very politely, the guy who seemed to know all about where I lived and where my family lived asked me if there was a bathroom in the back of the store. I said yes, and then he very politely said, "Go in there, close the door, and don't come out for at least half an hour." And just to make it very clear that he wasn't really asking me, he shows me that he's holding something inside his jacket, something heavy, and only then do I realize what's going on. Of course, I did exactly what the guy asked me to do, and at that point the men started taking all the USB sticks from the security cameras, messed up the monitors, and broke into the safe. The three men also started rifling through all the premium liquor boxes, which I could clearly hear from where I was. In short, these guys ransacked the whole place absolutely blind. The whole time they were wreaking havoc in the store, I remained sitting on the toilet in the bathroom, wondering how that man knew where my family lived and who everyone was. I was really confused and very puzzled when they finally finished their task. I heard footsteps walking towards the bathroom door. I started to tremble. The first thing that came to my mind was that they would now get rid of me so as not to leave any witnesses that could identify them. But as I was getting ready to be shot to death, I heard this voice on the other side of the door, telling me that I did the right thing for the sake of my family, and that all the things they had taken were insured so that no one but the insurance companies would lose a penny, then asked me to stay there for the next 10 minutes, and then do whatever I wanted to do. Logically, I did as he told me once again, waited 10 minutes, and only after that time did I come out of the bathroom where I was confined and called the police. Immediately after they arrived, I gave them my statement. I told them that it all happened very quickly and they must have been professional, as I didn't even get a chance to hit the alarm behind the counter. When they asked me what the men looked like, even though I had a good look at the boy's face, I only gave them vague descriptions, as I understood that giving away their identities could put my family at risk. That day, these men stole a haul of at least $10,000, and they did it all in less than half an hour. But the most incredible thing is that they managed to make sure that the only person capable of identifying them would not tell anyone about it. I can't even describe to you how terrifying it was to have a criminal describe to me in detail where my mother and sister lived. This, without a doubt, was the most terrifying experience I have ever had in my life. That same day I quit the store, but fortunately, the next day I got a new job as a waiter in a restaurant. For several years, I worked as a clerk in a retail store. I usually had a night assistant to help me, but it wasn't uncommon for me to end up spending the whole shift by myself, since it wasn't a very big store and the pace of work wasn't too intense. In fact, I worked slowly, just to avoid running out of things to do, and the terrifying experience I'm about to tell you about happened on one of those nights when I was alone and working at a leisurely pace. At the beginning of my shift, I loaded some boxes and moved into the aisles to start organizing the merchandise. This didn't take much mental effort, so my mind began to wander elsewhere, just thinking about random things, not really paying too much attention to what I was doing or what was around me. I wandered down about 3 aisles carrying these boxes full of products, and completely immersed in my thoughts, until a knock on the front door brought me back to reality out of the blue. I almost didn't register what it was because I was so lost in another world, but once I realized it, I was very confused. Whoever was knocking on the door was knocking loudly enough to echo throughout the store. I walked to the end of the aisle and looked out the large front window, and that's when I see a man in a hat standing in the doorway. I approached from the other side and let him know that we were closed and that we wouldn't be open until 8 in the morning. I told him this through the glass, but the man just stared at me without saying anything. I thought maybe he wasn't hearing me well through the glass, although I was talking loud enough for my voice to be heard on the other side of the door. However, I pointed out the sign, and once again told him I was sorry, but we were closed until morning. However, the man continued to stand there looking at me and saying nothing. I looked at him for a few seconds, expecting some sort of reaction from him, but seeing that he didn't do or say anything, I turned around and left. As I headed towards the back of the store to continue with my chore, I turned to look towards the door and saw him walking away. Then I looked back to the front for a few seconds, and when I looked back towards the entrance of the store, he was gone. I also didn't notice a car parked anywhere, which I thought was odd, as this store was on the side of a road quite far from the nearest residential area, so usually people drove there. The whole incident was strange, to say the least. However, I figured I was just in the wrong place or something. I finally went back to doing what I was doing, and as I placed the products on the shelves, I completely forgot about the man in the hat. When it was about 2 a.m., I was in the middle of the aisles and ready to grab my food, so I left the box on the floor and went to the break room, which was at the other end of the building. I was there for about half an hour while I ate. Once I finished my pasta with meat, I was ready to get back to work. I walked down the middle of the aisle where I had been setting up the producer a while ago. But when I picked up the list, I saw a man walking between the aisles, and looking straight ahead. The guy was at the other end of the store and seemed as if he was walking along as normal, not noticing my presence. It was the man in the hat. I stood frozen in the same spot where I was, and a sudden fear began to take hold of me. Now listening carefully, I could hear the man's footsteps moving toward the side of the building I had just come from, so I entered the hallway and hid behind the bookshelves. The footsteps sounded like they were heading towards the break room, but just before I left the aisle to try to run and get help, I heard these footsteps begin to speed up. He was now running through the store, and they were very close. Realizing this, I ran to the other end of the aisle, then looked back and saw the man turn and start running towards me. At this moment, I felt the adrenaline rushing through my body, and I ran full speed to the front door. I pulled the keys out of my pocket with shaking hands to try to open the door, and just as I opened it and finally got out of the building, I saw a shiny trapdoor out of the corner of my eye and heard a deafening sound. A gunshot so loud I didn't even know where it was coming from, but I ran full speed to save my life. The guy was already gone when the police arrived. I went into the store with the officers, and they found the back door open along with some heavy tools next to it. But the scariest part of their findings was that the hole made by the shooter was right next to the front door, just inches away from where I was when I heard the shot. Considering the target of the attack, and the fact that the man didn't take anything from the store other than some snacks, the police assumed it was some kind of drug addict having a psychotic break. A few years ago, I got a job at a well-known downtown hotel. I worked at the front desk at night. The hotel was pretty average size, maybe a little big. We don't have restaurants, bars, or anything like that in our facilities, but we have many very comfortable rooms, and we offer one of the best services in our city and at quite comfortable prices. That must be why we always have an important flow of customers all the time. At the front desk, there was almost never anything interesting going on, and most of the time the guests didn't even need to talk to me, which made my job really easy, and I didn't mind staying up all night. Anyway, the event I am going to tell you about happened on a Thursday, shortly after 2 in the morning. That night I was working behind the front desk and looked into the lobby and elevators. To my left was a living room and a hallway leading to the rooms on the second floor. Everything was very quiet as usual until a tall, middle-aged man entered the hotel. The man walked through the doors and passed me without saying a word. I assumed he was staying at the hotel and was returning to his room. Although I didn't go into too much detail, I could see that he was of average height, light brown hair, and I estimated him to be at least 35 or 40 years old. The subject walked down the hallway and left. About 5 minutes later, he passed by again, this time going to the other hallway. The truth is that I didn't think much of it, but soon I would see him a third time, this time going through another hallway, the one right behind me. This time, I did have a strange feeling, but more like a hunch than a real reason to be suspicious of him. Several minutes later, I went to get some water. There was a dispenser in the lounge, and you had to walk down the hall to get there. As I was walking past, I noticed someone a little further down the hall. I looked and saw it was the same guy, but now he was standing outside a door, and it looked like he couldn't get in, but he was trying. I thought maybe he was outside his room, or possibly he was trying to get into someone else's room. I started walking towards him and was going to ask him if he needed help with anything, but when I was a few steps away from him, he stopped and looked at me. I could tell some surprise on his face when he saw me, but before I could say anything, the guy turned and walked away in another direction and then disappeared around a corner. This did look suspicious to me. I started to think that the guy probably didn't even have a room here. I went back the way I came and returned to my reception. Once there, I decided to look at the security monitors. We had cameras in every hallway of the hotel, but unfortunately the video quality was pretty bad. Any detail was hard to make out. But let's just say I had already seen the man, so I had details of his appearance. and could recognize him quickly. I looked around until I finally saw the guy through one of the cameras, which caught him walking down one of the hallways and then stopping in front of a door. First, he seemed to be trying to open it, but then it looked like he was possibly knocking on the door at the time or something. He stood at it for a while and then walked around a bit before returning to the door again. At that point, I was too suspicious, so I decided to go ask him what was going on. I got up and walked to where the guy was. The hallways could get a little complicated on the second floor, but the second and third floors were very simple. But the second floor had more hallways, and the layout was somewhat asymmetrical. I walked to where the man was, and when I got to the beginning of the hallway, I saw him. He was way down, probably almost 100 feet, almost as soon as I had him in sight. He looked at me too, and before he could duck away again, I asked him what he was doing. At that point, without saying a word, he simply started running toward me. For a moment, I was completely paralyzed, but seeing the increased speed, I turned around and started running at full speed myself as well. Clearly, this was not what I was expecting, but in view of the fact that this guy was running in my direction, I had no choice. I started to head towards the front while the guy was still running and quickly approaching me. When I got back to the lobby, I noticed that he was much closer, and I could hear his footsteps getting closer and closer. I decided to run out of the hotel and see if the guy would make it. After I got outside, I noticed that he did, in fact, follow me, and came out the front door shortly thereafter, and paused for a moment, looking in several directions until he saw me. At that point, being only about 40 feet away from each other, we made eye contact for the first time, and then he broke into a run again in my direction. At that point, my first thought was to run to my car, but I thought I might make it in time if he was chasing me, so I ran across the street, and a little further down was a 24-hour gas station, so I ran there, and when I got there, I could see through the windows. That guy hadn't crossed the street and stayed in the hotel parking lot. I think he went back to the hotel after that, but I called the police right away. I reported a suspicious man who was trying to enter the hotel rooms and was chasing me. The police responded very quickly and got there only a minute later. They entered the hotel, and sure enough, the man was still inside. He tried to run away, but they caught him and took him out of the hotel. The guy never said what he was doing there, nor why he was trying to get into the rooms. After that, I talked to the police for a while and then went back to work. I was very frightened by the whole situation, but I was grateful to be okay. That was an experience that made me want to stop working nights, and I did shortly thereafter. About 15 years ago, when I was 20, I used to work at a gas station in Michigan. I was a convenience store clerk, which was open 24 hours a day. For several years, I covered the night shift, so as you can imagine, during my day I was alone most of the time. Working at night has its advantages and disadvantages. The biggest advantage is that there is not too much activity, so the work becomes a little less heavy, but the disadvantage is that by some kind of universal law, or what do I know, it seems that there are many more crazies on the loose at night than during the day, and the story I am going to tell you now is based precisely on a chilling encounter I had with one of them. The gas station I worked for was located across the street from some stores like Target and a few others, so the area had a lot of traffic during the day. A freeway was also close by, and the gas station was on a corner. All the adjacent businesses were closed in their entirety by 10 or 11 Mart at night, so things would be very quiet until probably 6 in the morning or so. I remember the first few days feeling a bit overwhelmed by the loneliness of the place. However, it only took me a few weeks to adjust. People rarely came into the store between midnight and 5 a.m. In fact, the average number of people coming in was probably around 4 or 5 per night, or about 1 customer per hour. One Wednesday night, I was working quietly. It was around 2 in the morning, and I was behind the counter. There was no one else inside the store, no cars at any of the gas pumps, no people passing by. At one point, I saw a car coming in from the street. It was a white van, one of those typical creepy vans that they always tell infamous stories of kidnappings and such. This one slowly approached and parked in one of the spaces in front. I was waiting for someone to get out of the van and get in, so I settled into the chair so I wouldn't look so lazy, since usually at those hours I lay reclined, and with my feet mounted on the counter, watching some movie, or listening to music. However, no one got out of the van right away. Instead, it remained parked there with the lights on for quite a while. I kept my eye out for a while, expecting that at some point someone would get out of the van and come to the store. But after sitting there for about 20 minutes, the van finally backed up. So I thought, okay, the guy is leaving. Maybe he regretted whatever it was he was coming to the store to do. But instead he moved to the side of the building. There were a few more parking spaces there too, and now he was out of my sight. Honestly, this seemed a little strange to me and, in the middle of the night, a little scary as well. I always did my best not to let anything scare me, but on this occasion, my intuition was telling me something was off. After the van ducked around the side of the building, probably about an hour passed. It was now after 3 a.m. No one entered the store during that time, and only one car pumped gas at the pump. But after a few moments, I noticed someone walking down the sidewalk toward the entrance. It appeared to be a man, and he had come from the side where the van had gone before. Could this be the driver, I wondered? The guy was wearing a huge black winter jacket with the hood over his head. He was also looking down, so I couldn't really see his face at all. He finally made it to the doors and then went inside. Once inside the store, the man walked to the right and away from me at the counter. After watching him disappear down an aisle, I focused my attention back on my phone. Several minutes passed, and when I looked up again, I noticed that the man was standing there, about 40 feet away. He was facing me and staring in my direction with an angry look on his face, and in a position that looked very threatening. He was standing with his legs slightly apart, both hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, and his gaze fixed on me. I'm not going to lie to you. At that moment, I felt quite scared, but also confused. It was clear that his behavior was not normal at all, and frankly, I had no idea what he wanted to do. After looking at me in that strange way for about 10 seconds in which he didn't move or move away, I decided to greet him politely and ask him if I could help him with something. He didn't answer. Instead, he just kept standing there. Then I asked him if he was okay, and the man didn't answer me either. I was really confused and wasn't sure exactly what to do in that situation. After standing there for a few more seconds, making terribly uncomfortable eye contact that had me shivering, the man simply turned and slowly walked out of the store. He walked back down the sidewalk and then moved to the side of the building. Less than a minute later, I saw the white van drive away. At that moment, I let out all the air that was held in my lungs, and I was very glad that this weirdo was gone. The rest of my shift was pretty quiet, fortunately. Eventually, a few more people came in and I relaxed a bit, but every now and then, the image of that creepy guy would come back into my head, looking at me like a psychopath. I tried to figure out what he was doing, so I decided to walk down the hallway where the guy had been. But I didn't see anything unusual. Everything seemed to be in order. But his behavior was definitely strange. After that first encounter, everything went on in complete normalcy for the next 3 or 4 nights. I don't remember right now. But I know that a few days later, around 2 a.m. or so, I was again alone in the store. There were no customers inside, no cars at the pumps. And that's when I saw a car pulling into the gas station. And to my absolute horror, I soon realized it was an old white van, exactly the same as the one from the other night. I immediately remembered what had happened, and it immediately made me tense up. I began to pray with all my might that it wasn't the same type, because I was already feeling very scared. This time, the van drove slowly around the gas pumps and drove into the parking spaces in front, then turned and began backing into one of the spaces. After watching the van park, I sat there for several minutes without taking my eyes off it. But suddenly I heard a car door open and soon saw what appeared to be the same man walking around it. The guy went to the back of the van and opened it. A short time later, he came out holding something. I tried to focus my eyes to see what he was pulling out of the car and realized it was something like a crowbar. Then he closed the back doors of his truck and started walking slowly towards the entrance. He was wearing the same outfit as last time, and his attitude seemed to be the same. I had a bad feeling right away. I watched him walk slowly towards the front doors, and after entering, he turned and started walking towards the back of the store. He quickly got out of sight, and everything in the store became extremely quiet. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my heart pounding loudly behind my chest. and a terrible feeling of panic started to take over me. About 5 minutes passed, and suddenly I heard a crashing sound. It sounded like the man had hit something, probably with his crowbar. I heard a big bang after that. It was like he was hitting things. I started to feel very terrified. I felt that at any moment he would jump towards the counter and hit me with that iron crowbar. However, I was so terrified that I couldn't move a muscle. For several seconds afterwards, he seemed to come closer, and then I saw him appear a few days away looking at me exactly the same as last time, but now as a huge iron crowbar in his hands. That was enough to thaw me out, and in a split second behind the counter and I ran out of the store. I wasn't getting paid enough to stand there and deal with it. I ran full speed to my car and then called the police. I waited there with the doors locked guarding the store. I was parked behind the gas pump, so I was a safe distance from the store. Probably about 3 or 4 minutes after I called the police, I saw the guy come out of the store. The guy slowly walked out as if nothing had happened and got back into his truck. Less than a minute after he left, the police arrived. I immediately met them and told them the man was gone. We went into the store to see what had happened, and what we found was a bunch of stuff off the shelves. Everything was in disarray because the guy hit it with his crowbar. It was like he had gone crazy. I watched it all unfold on the surveillance tapes, and the guy was just banging on stuff and then quietly walked away. It was the craziest thing I had ever seen. After that incident, the police investigated to try to find the man. They also had a police officer on site at night. However, I resigned a few days later. I later found out that a couple of weeks later, the guy came back, so I feel very fortunate to have retired from that job in time. I used to work in a small convenience store in town. It wasn't quite downtown, but it was close enough. There were a lot of people walking on the sidewalk during the day, and at night there were still a fair amount of passers-by outside, especially after the nearby bars closed, so our store was open 24 hours. It was pretty small, but it was stocked with all kinds of snacks, drinks, and things like that people would probably be looking for at all hours. There were only 5 aisles, and then I would be behind the counter at the other end of the store near the doors. I worked there for several months, and usually worked there during the night. Sometimes it was quite busy, and sometimes it was very quiet. I never really knew, and it depended on a lot of things, but between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m., it was usually the quietest. One day I was working, and was alone on a night like any other. It was a little after 3 a.m., and the store was empty. Every once in a while I looked out the window to the street, and there was absolute silence. I was sitting behind the counter talking on the phone, and pretty soon I heard the door open and saw a woman walking in. She entered the store and walked down one of the first aisles. Several minutes passed, and she appeared to be shopping as usual, like any customer. Finally, when she got to the center, she dropped off several items, and as I was starting to scan them, she told me she only had $3 and asked if I could give her an offer. I don't remember exactly what I was buying, but I remember it added up to about $15 total. I told her I couldn't do that. Obviously she could. I had to return some things. I told her I could only get things that added up to $3. It seemed like common math to me. However, the woman got really mad and said she wasn't going to pay anything. I told her she wasn't going to pay, she had to leave. Then she stormed out of the store. She was very angry. Occasionally customers would be rude or try to get things for free. I mean, being in a city in the middle of the night, all kinds of people would come in. I was kind of used to these kinds of customers, and I thought I knew how to deal with them, but I was wrong. Probably 20 or 30 minutes went by. No more customers came in during that time. Then the door opened and I saw the woman come back, but behind her was a man. This guy was big. He had long hair, a black t-shirt, heavy leather boots, and a goatee. He looked like quite the metalhead. I guess he was the woman's husband or boyfriend. The man approached me looking very angry and then accused me of being rude to the woman. I don't remember what his name was, but the guy started calling me names and didn't really give me any chance to speak. I could smell the alcohol on his breath as he verbally attacked me. The woman was simply backing up a few feet and adding some extra insulting words to me. I remember after I was yelled at for a minute straight, the man invited me outside to settle things like men. I told them both to get out of my store before calling the police. That's when the guy suddenly pushed me back. At the counter, I wasn't ready for that, and to be honest, he was a strong guy. I fell backwards and he knocked me down. When I got up, I saw that the guy was right at the counter wanting to fight me. I moved to the right, where we had an alarm, which I immediately turned on. It was a very loud alarm and the sound filled the whole store. It was also very annoying, and the guy then moved away from the counter, grabbed some random stuff from the shelves and threw it at me. But it wasn't enough for him. He also knocked down a drink stand and then went to another aisle and grabbed some more stuff from the shelves, stuffed it in his pockets, and the woman at the same time grabbed some stuff with him, and then they both left stealing a bunch of stuff from the store. Obviously, I called the police and they arrived several minutes later. The man and woman had already left, although all I could do was give a description and my account of what happened. Fortunately, neither returned while I was working again, but neither were apprehended as far as I knew. I used to work the night shift at a well-known club downtown. It wasn't a scary job at all, unless you count the state of the girls and the state of the bathrooms at the end of the night. But I'm going to tell you about one thing that happened to me as a result of that job that will stay with me for the rest of my life. This is a two-part story, one considerably scarier than the other, so I'll start with the first part. I was working my shift as normal, and it was getting close to closing time, so I was cleaning out the ice wells, putting together bottles of liquor and all that usual closing time stuff. Right in front of me, there was a group of people doing shots and dancing, and out of the corner of my eye, I see a guy and his girlfriend who were in a dark corner of the bar. Apparently, they were having a great night. At that moment, a younger guy came into the bar and asked one of my colleagues for a drink. He starts trying to chat with this couple, and the girl's boyfriend, or whatever it was about her, looks in a bad mood. You know? He was hanging out with her, while the guy who just walked in says, "Hey, how are you guys? Where were you tonight? Blah, 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 blah." It's really making me laugh a little bit, because the girl's boyfriend obviously doesn't want to chat, but the young guy just doesn't get the hint because he's drunk and in such a good mood. I don't pay much attention to it because it doesn't look like a fight is going to start. Not at first. Not until the younger guy starts chatting with the grumpy guy's girlfriend. The grumpy guy doesn't take it well at all and basically starts telling the kid to get lost. Which, to his credit, this guy knows where he is, he's not welcome, and he's not going to waste his time trying to cheer them up. Next thing I know, the grumpy couple finishes their drinks and seem to be leaving. However, on their way out, they pass the younger guy who watches them go and waves goodbye. Now, from where I am, I can't see if the younger guy might have said something sarcastic or given the grumpy guy a cheeky look, or any other disrespectful gesture, but either way, the grumpy guy lunged at him and threw what looked like a punch, or tried to, because it actually looked like the attempted punch had slid down the side of the guy's face, like his fist slid up and down, and only managed to graze his ear. By this time I was already exhausted from my work, so I opted to tell one of the younger staff members to take over, as it was almost certain that there would now be a fight. However, this did not happen. The staff positioned themselves at the door hoping to contain a dispute, but instead, the couple left quietly. In the end, the younger boy did not react to this blow, but simply moved out of the way and avoided any trouble, most likely so that he would not be thrown out. I just remember thinking thankfully to this guy for his reaction, as he saved us from having to take care of a fight when we are already about to end the night. I continued cleaning my station, and once I was done, I decided to go out for a cigarette, and that's when my jaw hit the floor. The younger guy, the one who was trying to cheer up the couple, had a big cut on his head, and there was a lot of blood coming out. The cut he had was right behind his ear, and because of where it was, the blood was gushing out of it. At the sight of it, people started to panic, and a girl who was inside the bar started to restrain the wound, to prevent it from continuing to leak blood. If I remember correctly, the girl was a nurse. We immediately called an ambulance, and it looked like a scene from a war movie or something. I couldn't even smoke the first cigarette, because everything became quite chaotic. The door staff ran out to get towels to try to stop the bleeding, and while the girl was trying to press the wound with the towels to stop the blood from gushing out, the boy says, "I'm so cold," and that was creepy. We were in the middle of autumn by then, and the weather was quite warm that night. However, This little boy was shivering, saying he was freezing. By Jesus, I thought he was going to die. And obviously he did too. It was absolutely terrifying and certainly the worst shift I've ever had to work on. But it didn't end there. The next day I decided to call a friend of mine who used to sell me some Maria from time to time, and I told her that I would like to buy something because I had had the worst shift the night before, and I was still pretty shaken up about it, so I went through my stuff and started telling her all about the incident the night before with the kid who got stabbed, and that I didn't even know what had happened. I didn't know if this kid had survived, because they just put him in an ambulance and that was the last we heard of him. So at that point my friend looked at me and told me the name of the club I work at, referring to the boy. But it wasn't a question, more like a statement that that was the place where he had been injured. I was surprised that he knew that, but then I thought, oh my God, he had died. Surely it had been in the paper. I immediately asked her just that. How she knew, because I'm pretty sure she didn't know where I worked. I never told her. Then she gives me a knowing look and tells me that the boy who was stabbed was the little brother of her boss. This kid's name was David, and my friend's boss was like a big man in the area where she lived. He was in charge of a small group that sold all the drugs in the area, and not just Maria, but other pretty hard stuff as well. He moved a lot of weight under the cover of some legitimate businesses, and these were not people you wanted to mess with. These were the kind of people who were super nice to you if they liked you. And if you had financial problems, they would be able to help you out. No problem. Only if you were on their side, but if they didn't like you or you messed with them in any way, oh man, you were in trouble. Knowing this left me a bit shocked. But anyway, we ended our talk about it with her assuring me that this boy, David, was still alive, just in very bad shape. A few days later, I get a call from an unknown number. This was a guy who worked for the big man, i.e. the kid's brother. This one wanted to know if I was free to talk. I said yes, just not over the phone, and he replies, "Okay, I'll be at your place in 5 minutes, it's ready." I didn't even have time to ask him what it was about, but I didn't need to. I knew well what this meeting was going to be about. The guy showed up and called me from the street while I was in his car, and I invited him in, but it turns out he wanted me to accompany him to the big man's house, which turned out to be an apartment above a corner store, about a 10-minute drive from my work. You're probably wondering why I dared to accept the invitation. You see, I grew up in one of these barrios, and I know perfectly well how things are handled. If a big guy like this contacts you because he wants something from you, you can't refuse because they are not really asking you if you want to cooperate or not. They are ordering you, and with this kind of people, it is better to cooperate. We got to the place. It was a small apartment, but it was decorated and pretty fancy. Like a good dealer, everything was top of the line, huge TV sets everywhere, and in the living room was this guy, Ross, who I had seen a lot around the neighborhood. He was short but super intimidating, not just because I knew what he did for a living, but because he just had this intensity about him. Not to mention the twisted-looking guy next to him, who told me he'd been in too many street fights or played rugby, and not many people play rugby where I live. We're a soccer town, not a rugby town. But anyway, Ross starts telling me that if I contact the police and tell him I saw a knife, even though I didn't see it, he would make it worth my while. Basically, I saw the whole cutting thing. But if I told him exactly the truth about what I'd seen, there wouldn't be a conviction. That's how flimsy the law is. Apparently, the police had already told him that there just wasn't the right angle on the club's CCTV to make a solid case against the guy who had cut it, so I had to bend the law, so to speak, which I had no problem with after all. It was basically the right thing to do. I was amazed at how this big moment went. The drug dealer was working as close to the police as if he was Tony Soprano, and had taken the law into his own hands or something like that, but believe it or not, it's a more common thing than you might think. Sometimes people who live on the wrong side of the law also needed to work for and with them from time to time. I guess that's how crazy the world is, so yes, I talk to the police, I tell them everything, and then I think that's the last I'll hear. But again, life is full of false endings, and this is where the second part of the story really begins. Months go by, and I think everything has been taken care of. Or rather, I was hoping everything had been taken care of, but once again, I get a call from an unknown number asking me if I can talk. This time I know the drill. So I put on some clothes and get ready to be taken back to this place above the corner store to talk to Ross. Only this time, when I walk into the living room, it's not just Ross sitting there. It was this whole group of guys who also looked bad, and on the TV was what was obviously some footage from the security camera system. No, I'm too sure if this is legal, but I'm pretty sure you can't just walk into a business and say, "Hey, give me copies of your security camera footage." I think actually only the police can do that, namely force business owners to give them the CCTV footage, and to do that, they have to violate a lot of data protection laws, but that's beside the point. So in front of all these very intimidating-looking guys, Ross presses the play button on the TV remote, which starts a slideshow of still images from a bunch of different cameras, and starts asking me to tell him if I recognize anyone. These are still images from a bar I didn't work at. I didn't even know which one it really was. He had a lot of questions about how he had managed to track down this guy who cut up his brother, but obviously this wasn't the time to ask them. I was looking at all these photographs, while Ross was incisively asking me if I recognized them, and if I recognized the guy in them, I say no. This goes on for a long time. Lots of different guys show up too, and every time I have to tell him I don't recognize him, both he and everyone in the room, including me, start to get pretty frustrated, like they were sure they had found their guy, and it really wasn't. I really felt bad about having to tell them now, like I had reached the point where Ross starts to lose his cool. "Dude, don't you recognize a single person there? None of them." I looked this guy straight in the eye, the scariest guys I've ever had the misfortune of being in a room with, and I said, "Look, I want to help you here, but I know what the score is, and I can't tell you it's someone I'm not sure about." I felt so proud when all these scary guys in the room nodded towards me as if to say, "Good boy," as if I had done something super honorable. Actually, I wanted them to get the right guy too. The police obviously hadn't been able to help them, and if I could help get a small piece of justice, so be it. Then it looked like I was getting to the end of the footage and we had had no luck. But then, I saw him. This guy had blonde hair and was a little chubby around the waist, with a grumpy face I wouldn't forget. And that's when I got that feeling in my gut, when you recognize someone you just met but you're completely certain who it is. It's him. I spoke very loudly and getting up from my seat. "Him. That one over there in the plaid shirt. That's the man you're looking for." As I said this, everyone in the room turned to look at me and made a satisfied gesture, as if we got him, while the first thing that came to my mind was, "You're a dead man." And the truth is, I didn't feel quite right about that, even though this guy deserved it. "Are you sure?" "Sure," I reply. "Look, if there's someone on that tape who was in the bar the night David was cut, it's him. I'm 100% sure," I tell him. Then the room went silent. You could hear a pin drop at that moment. All these guys were sitting, looking at each other, and I suddenly felt very, very unpleasant. I knew they had things to discuss and I couldn't be there to listen to them, mainly for my own sake. So the big man, Ross, drove me home. And as we drove, my curiosity got the better of me, and the truth is, when I look back on it now, it makes me shudder. I asked him, "What are you going to do with the guy in the picture?" Ross just doesn't say anything, not a word. He just keeps driving as if he hadn't heard what I had asked him. It was actually very creepy, really scary. "Do you watch gangster movies?" he said to me in a somewhat sickly manner and breaking the tense silence that had formed. I can only tell you, I'm going to have a lot of fun with him. But it didn't sound like fun for me to be in the car with a guy who was obviously planning something terribly violent. A guy who had the power, the clout, and the intimidation factor to be able to get some CCTV footage like that. A guy with the guts to talk to the police about kidnapping his brother's attacker, while he was selling all kinds of illegal stuff right under their noses. It was more scary than funny. Ross gave me a ride home, and I thanked him for giving me a ride. Before he got me out of the car, he said, "You're a good boy, Jim. You're a good boy." I can't even describe how scary it was to walk up the stairs to my apartment and realize what I had done. I basically condemned a man to death and whatever horrible thing they were going to do to him before I finished him off. I condemned him to that too, as well as, yes, I know he had brought it on himself that something would happen to him sooner or later. But that didn't make me feel any better. This event, This is one of the few things in my life that really haunts me. Even some of the more traumatic things that I've been through, I've been able to get through. I've even been able to talk about it, and I've found a way to even laugh about it. But not this. This is something I really don't like to talk about. I don't want people to know that I was involved in this, and that's why I've changed some places and names here. The names of the people involved, even the legitimate business, Ross, and even mine, are fictitious. It wasn't a corner store. I will tell you that it was something absolutely clean, something that you really wouldn't expect to be in front of a drug ring. Like I said, I try not to think about it, and maybe writing this has been a good way to process it. Because sooner or later I will have to face the fact that somewhere, there is a dead body that didn't have a proper funeral or burial. The body of a person who suffered horribly before he died, probably in so much pain that he wanted to die before it finally happened. And all that suffering, all that death falls on me. A few years ago, I was working as a night security guard at a company. I don't remember exactly what company it was, but it wasn't that popular or anything like that. I worked at a lot of different places back then doing security. It was an easy job because I would sit at a desk all night. Literally. Nothing ever happened on most shifts. I didn't even talk to anybody. Sometimes one or two at the most. I could use my phone and look around and get paid for it. But at this particular company, it was a pretty standard office building for the most part. Inside there was a lobby, and I would sit at a desk there. I had a computer with basic information on it, and the building wasn't really close to anything in particular, rather it was kind of isolated. The only other people who were there during the night were a security guard and a janitor. The other security guard for the most part would be outside, and I knew both him and the janitor, and I didn't see much of them other than when I was arriving or leaving, or when the janitor was cleaning the lobby at the time I was coming into work and cleaning behind the desk. One night, I guess it was around 1 in the morning, as I sat behind the desk, I would occasionally look around. My view was mainly of the front door and the window to the side. Outside was a parking lot that was empty, and behind the parking lot was a fence. I was just casually looking around when suddenly I saw this guy walking towards the door. He looked in and looked at me. It was very strange to see him because no one had ever come to the door before, but then I realized that this man standing at the door was smiling in the creepiest way. A horrifying smile that I had never seen before. His eyes were so wide open as if they were about to pop out of their sockets. It was very disturbing. He had to be joking or something. The man made no attempt to enter the building, although he just stood there in the doorway and kept staring at me. I wasn't sure what to do, so I waved at him. He didn't wave back. Then he was out of sight and I couldn't see him anymore. I was really confused by what had just happened. I had no idea where the guy had come from or what exactly he was doing. I tried to ignore him and figured the outside security guard would soon see the guy, so I called him to let him know. But he hadn't seen him at all. I got up and walked to the door, but the guy was no longer in sight. I went back to my desk and stood there for the next 30 minutes or so. Then the guy came back. I just looked up and there he was, standing in the doorway and looking again with the same creepy smile. This time I got up, but as soon as I did, he was out of sight. I walked to the door and opened it. The man was already gone. He must have escaped somewhere. I walked outside until I found the other security guard, told him what had happened, and we talked for a while. Neither of us knew where the guy had gone. We looked around the property and after that, but he must have left. Then I went back inside the building, which was big enough to have evaded us easily. And don't ask me why, but there were hardly any security cameras outside. There were a bunch inside, but only 2 outside that didn't even cover that much space. I didn't see him again for the rest of the night. In fact, I never saw him again. I still wonder who he was and what he was doing.